There is a world in the records of the Inquisition that appears without coordinates. Its system designation has been redacted from every chart that once carried it, and the few surviving references to it by name describe a place that should not have existed, and certainly should never have been settled by human hands. The world was called Nostramo Quintus. It had no sun worth speaking of. Or rather, it had a sun, but the sun had dimmed over the millennia, retreating from the yellow warmth of youth into the cold, fading red of something that had burned too long and was not quite finished dying. The light it cast on Nostramo was not darkness exactly. It was something worse. It was the kind of light that falls on a world and does nothing for it. A thin, anemic, reddish murk that made everything look like it was seen through old blood. Nostramo was rich. Not in any way that made life pleasant, but in the geological sense. In the deep mineral wealth that runs through certain worlds and makes them useful to the interstellar economy of an expanding human civilization. The world had been settled during the dark age of technology, when humanity was spreading through the stars with the arrogant confidence of a species that had not yet learned the price of overreach. Settlers came, mines were dug, cities were built, and then the darkness that Nostramo produced in its people, slowly and thoroughly over generations, turned those cities into something that the original settlers would not have recognized as civilization. The aristocracy of Nostramo owned the mines and the refineries and the processing stations. They lived in towers above the perpetual industrial smog, insulated from the world their wealth produced. And they maintained their position through the oldest and most straightforward of methods. Violence delegated to specialists. The criminal gangs that controlled Nostramo's underhive were not independent of the aristocracy. They were its mechanism. The wealthy kept the gangs loyal through bribes and information and occasional protection. And the gangs kept the working population compliant through beatings and disappearances, and the occasional public example that reminded everyone of the distance between having power and not having it. This arrangement had persisted for so long that it had achieved the status of natural law on Nostramo. People were not taught that it was wrong. They were taught that it was how things were. Children who survived the underhive long enough to become adults had internalized, without being told, the fundamental operating principles of their world, that strength meant the freedom to do what you liked to the weak, that mercy was a luxury performed by the powerful for the observation of their peers, and that justice was a word used by people who had enough power to define it however served their interests. Nostramo did not produce criminals in the way that desperate worlds sometimes produce criminals, as people pushed past the point of lawful survival into necessary transgression. It produced criminals in the way that a factory produces a product, efficiently, at scale, without apology. Something fell from the sky onto Nostramo, not a ship, not a transport, not the kind of controlled descent that colonization vessels made. Something that arrived in the particular violent way that the scattered Primarchs arrived on their worlds, propelled by forces that the warp could not quite explain, and that subsequent imperial theology would describe as the Emperor's children finding the homes that had been prepared for them. What fell on Nostramo found the world ready to shape it. The child who survived the fall, who survived the underworld of Nostramo afterward, who was not killed by the gangs or starved in the dark streets, or broken by the grinding hopelessness that Nostramo inflicted on everything that lived there, was not a normal child. He could not have been. The physical capabilities that the Primarch genome provided kept him alive where any human child would have died. The enhanced metabolism, the speed, the reflexes, the resistance to the toxins that the industrial atmosphere of Nostramo put into everything. These kept his body functioning. What kept his mind together in those early years is harder to explain. He had visions. The records that survive Nostramo's eventual destruction, preserved in fragmentary form in the archives of the Inquisition and in the Legion histories that were written and then classified and then written again by those who had survived both the heresy and the aftermath, describe the visions as something that would have broken most minds. They were not visions in the soft, metaphorical sense of the word. They were not impressions or feelings, or the kind of half-formed intuition that some psychers describe as foreknowledge. They were precise, detailed, vivid experiences of events that had not yet happened, rendered in such complete sensory fidelity that the child experiencing them could not, in the moment of experience, distinguish the vision from reality. They felt like memory. They were, in some sense, that the scholars of the Librarius have never been able to satisfactorily categorize, more accurate than memory. They showed what would happen, not what might happen, not what could happen in one of several possible futures. What would happen, with the fixed and terrible certainty of a fact already recorded, waiting only to be experienced in the sequence that ordinary time demanded. He saw people die. He saw violence of a specific, detailed quality that went well beyond anything a child should have been able to imagine or endure witnessing. He saw futures that the people he encountered had not yet lived through, and those futures were, with consistent and exhausting regularity, but not bad in the sense that futures sometimes appear bad in retrospect, through the distorting lens of disappointment or grief. Bad in the categorical sense, in the sense that contained suffering and cruelty, and the specific darkness that Nostramo specialized in producing. He saw what Nostramo was. He saw what it would do to the people living in it, and he saw with that same awful precision what it would do to him. The child who would become the Night Haunter, and also Konrad Curze, depending on which account you trust and which moment in his life you're examining, responded to what he saw the way an intelligence of exceptional capability responds to a problem that cannot be tolerated. He tried to solve it. Not the visions. The visions could not be solved. He could not close his eyes and choose not to see. He tried to solve Nostramo. He began to kill, not randomly, not in the way that Nostramo's gangs killed for profit or territory or the maintenance of existing hierarchies. He killed precisely, deliberately, with the specific intent of eliminating the sources of the suffering he had seen in his visions. He killed gang leaders. He killed the men who ran the protection operations in specific neighborhoods. He killed the aristocrats who employed those men and who went home to their towers above the smog, believing that their insulation from the consequences of their choices made them immune to consequences of any kind. He killed them in ways that Nostramo could understand, which is to say in ways that were spectacular enough to communicate clearly to a population that had been educated entirely in the language of violence. He displayed bodies. He left messages written in the idiom that fear speaks most fluently. He made examples. And it worked. This is the thing that has to be said about Nostramo under the Night Haunters campaign. The thing that makes his story uniquely uncomfortable among all the stories that the Age of Darkness produced. It worked. crime fell, not gradually, not tentatively, but dramatically and thoroughly, as if the entire apparatus of criminal exploitation that had run Nostramo for generations had been a machine that required only the right interference to stop. The gangs dissolved or kept to whatever shadows the Night Haunter had not yet found. The aristocrats who survived changed their behavior, or changed it enough that the surface appearance was different even if the underlying nature was not. People who had lived in the grinding misery of the Nostramo underhive, who had never known a night safe enough to sleep without one ear open, found themselves in something that was not quite safety, but was close enough to it that the difference mattered. They were afraid. The compliance of Nostramo under the Night Haunter was not the compliance of people who had been shown a better way and chosen it. It was the compliance of people who understood, with the specific and very personal understanding that comes from knowing what the alternative looks like, that the alternative was worse than what they currently had. They did not love the Night Haunter. They did not pray to him or erect shrines to him or perform any of the rituals by which people express genuine devotion to something they believe in. They kept the law because they knew what had happened to people who had not kept the law, and the knowing was sufficient. The Night Haunter had not made Nostramo good. He had made it scared, but scared looked the same as good from a distance, and the Night Haunter, whose visions showed him the future with such agonizing precision, did not need to look closely at the distance to understand what he was actually producing. He knew. This is the piece of the Night Haunter's psychology that the later philosophical debates within the Night Lord's Legion, debates that Konrad Curze himself sometimes participated in, with a detachment that his lieutenants found deeply unsettling, returned to again and again. He knew that what he had built on Nostramo was not justice. It was the simulation of justice performed through the machinery of terror. It was compliance purchased with a currency that could only be spent once, because the moment the terror was removed, the compliance would end. He knew that Nostramo would not continue to be ordered once he was no longer there to frighten it into order. The visions told him. They showed him what Nostramo would become in his absence. They showed him that everything he had built would dissolve back into what it had been, as if he had never been there at all. Because what he had built was not actually on Nostramo. It was in the memory of fear, and fear's memory is short when the thing that caused it is gone. He built it anyway. He continued his campaign of terror, knowing precisely that it would not outlast him, because the alternative was doing nothing, and the visions had shown him what doing nothing looked like too. There is a particular quality of despair in a man who acts knowing that his actions will not produce what he wants them to produce, who does the work anyway because the work is all there is, who commits to the method in the full knowledge of its inadequacy because he cannot find the adequate method. Konrad Curze carried that despair from Nostramo forward through everything that came after, and the shape of it is visible in everything he did, and every argument he made, and every choice he made when choices were presented to him. The Emperor found him. The finding of the Primarchs was, in most cases, an occasion of something approaching celebration. Those moments when the scattered sons came back to the father who had been searching for them, and the great crusade gained a new weapon and a new purpose. Some of those moments were warm. Some were transformative in ways that the participants described afterward in terms that bordered on spiritual. The finding of the Night Haunter was not like that. The records describe a meeting in the darkness of Nostramo. In whatever pass for a throne room the Night Haunter had established in the criminal kingdom he had made from the ruin of the aristocracy he had dismantled. The Emperor came with his custodes and his honor guard, and the weight of an unfolding civilization behind him, and he found a pale figure in the darkness, with black veins visible beneath skin that had never seen light enough to warm it, with long dark fingernails that had grown and been shaped over years into something that was somewhere between a tool and a weapon, sitting in the quiet that terror makes around itself. The meeting, by all accounts, was not warm. There was recognition. The recognition between a father and a son that does not require words, because the connection between them runs deeper than words. But beneath the recognition, in Curze's eyes, if not the Emperor's, there was something else. There was the knowledge that the visions had already shown him, the future that his precognition had already delivered, and that knowledge cast a shadow over every subsequent moment. He gave the Emperor what the Emperor needed. He placed his legion, the legion that had been assembling in his name and drawing from the worst of Nostramo's population to do it, at the disposal of the Great Crusade. He submitted, in the formal sense that Primarch submitted to the Emperor's authority, acknowledging the hierarchy and the purpose and the project. He was Konrad Curze when he did this. Curze, the man who understood the argument, who saw the logic of the crusade, who could participate in its politics and its diplomacy and its strategic planning with the intelligence and the capability that his genes demanded. The Night Haunter, the other self, the one that Nostramo had made in the darkness before the Emperor arrived, stayed quiet for a while. Not because it was gone, because it was waiting. To understand what the Night Lords became, you have to understand what they were built to be. Every Space Marine Legion had a purpose that shaped it. Every Primarch's nature expressed itself in the Legion that bore his gene seed, in the way that a craftsman's character expresses itself in the work of his hands. The Ultramarines were builders, and their Legion built systems and structures and the institutional frameworks that made the Imperium function at scale. The Space Wolves were hunters, and their Legion hunted with the particular ferocity of beings who had learned to love the chase as much as the kill. The Blood Angels were artists and warriors and poets of violence, their beauty a counterweight to the darkness they operated in. The Night Lords were made to terrify. This was not incidental to their purpose. It was their purpose, stated and refined and applied as a deliberate military and political doctrine across a crusade that was, let us be precise about this, building an empire, and empires require compliance. And compliance requires that those who resist compliance understand the cost of resistance. The Night Lords were that understanding made manifest. They went to worlds where the conventional forces of the crusade had failed to achieve compliance, or where compliance had been achieved and then lost, or where the threat of resistance remained even after the surface of the problem appeared to be solved. They went to those worlds and they made examples, and then they left, and the world stayed compliant. Because the memory of what examples look like is a powerful thing. The methods were not ambiguous. They were not the kind of methods that could be described in the operational reports that went to terror and read as something acceptably brutal, in the way that war is always brutal. They were specific and considered and pedagogically precise. in the way that all effective terror is pedagogically precise. The Night Lords understood that terror is not just the immediate experience of something horrible. Terror is the communication of that experience to those who did not directly experience it, through whatever medium most effectively transmits the emotional content, a body in the right place, displayed in the right way, communicating the right information about what happens to the kind of person who does the kind of thing that person did, is more effective than 1,000 soldiers. A city that wakes to find that its garrison has been crucified on its own walls will comply with requests for compliance that it would previously have required significant military persuasion to accept. The Night Lords understood all of this. They thought about it, systematically, with the kind of intelligence that the Primarch genome produces when it produces intelligence oriented toward a specific domain. They were not sadists in the simple sense of beings who hurt because they enjoyed hurting. Some of them were. Nostramo produced sadists as reliably as it produced all the other categories of human darkness. And those sadists found their way into the Legion's ranks because the selection processes that filtered for the right kind of warrior in other legions had different priorities in the Night Lords. But the Legion's doctrine was not sadism. The doctrine was communication. The doctrine was the deliberate calibration of the horror inflicted in service of the message the horror was supposed to send. Sevatar understood this better than anyone in the Legion except Curze himself. Jago Sevatarion, called Sevatar, called the Prince of Crows by enemies who had the luxury of calling him anything before he was done with them, was the first captain of the Night Lords, and in almost every operational sense, the practical expression of what the Legion was. He was brilliant in the particular way that the Night Lords produced brilliance, which is to say with an edge on it, a quality of intelligence that cut as it illuminated, that could see the structure of any situation and the optimal points at which to apply pressure without ever quite losing sight of the fact that he was doing something that the rest of the galaxy would, given the opportunity, condemn without reservation. He knew what he was. This is the thing about Sevatar that the records preserve most clearly, the quality that later novelists and chroniclers who wrote about the Night Lords kept returning to because it was so unusual and so unsettling. He knew what he was. He did not deceive himself. He did not maintain the kind of careful self-mythology that many of the most effective practitioners of violence in the Crusade maintained. The stories they told themselves about necessity and duty, and the greater good that made the specific acts of their careers tolerable to contemplate. Sevatar contemplated his acts without that protection, and found them exactly what they were and continued to perform them anyway. Not because he lacked the moral capacity to understand them, because he had concluded, somewhere in the darkness of Nostramo's underhive where he had been recruited, that the moral capacity to understand something and the necessity of doing it anyway were not in fundamental conflict if you were honest enough to admit what you were doing and why. He was loyal to Curze in the way that people are loyal to something they recognize completely. He saw Curze clearly, the dual nature, the visionary and the monster, the philosopher and the creature that Nostramo had made before the philosophy was added to it, and he was loyal to all of it, because loyalty to something you see clearly is the only kind of loyalty that holds when everything else is stripped away. The confrontation came, as most confrontations that matter in the history of the Great Crusade came, from an accumulation that finally reached a point where it could no longer be contained by the institutional structures that had been containing it. The Night Lord's methods had been a subject of complaint among the other Primarchs for years before the confrontation became direct. The complaints took different forms depending on the Primarch making them. Some objected on the grounds of efficiency, arguing that compliance achieved through terror produced exactly the kind of sullen, explosive non-compliance that required military intervention to address at regular intervals. Some objected on the grounds of the imperial truth, that project of rational civilization that the Great Crusade was supposedly building, which was difficult to square with the imagery of civilian populations crucified on their own city walls. Some objected because they found the Night Lords simply distasteful, in the way that people who must work alongside something they find fundamentally wrong sometimes find it easier to frame their objection as aesthetic rather than moral. Sanguinius objected differently. The Primarch of the Blood Angels, the most luminous of the Primarchs in the estimation of most of his brothers, the one whose beauty and grace and visible goodness made him the embodiment of what the Emperor seemed to mean when he talked about the potential of humanity, objected to the Night Lords because he could not maintain the comfortable ambiguity that most objections to the Night Lords allowed. He had stood in the aftermath of Night Lords' operations. He had seen specifically what the Night Lords' methods produced, and specifically who it was produced upon. He could not persuade himself that what he had seen was acceptable within any framework he was willing to inhabit, and he was honest enough to say so. His confrontation with Curze was one of those moments that the heresy era records preserve with a specificity that suggests multiple witnesses and a general understanding that what was happening was significant. Sanguinius had come to Curze's flagship, to the deck of the vessel that the Night Lord's flagship had been decorated, to express as clearly as possible what the Night Lords were. All dark iron and hanging chains and the kind of deliberate atmosphere that communicated before words could. He had come, and he had made his objection directly, which was the only way to make an objection to Curze that Curze respected enough to engage with. He had said, in terms that the records summarize but whose specific content can be inferred from Curze's response, that what the Night Lords did was wrong. Not ineffective, not politically complicated. Wrong. Curze's response was the response that Curze gave to this argument every time it was made, which was often enough that by this point he had refined it to a quality that his interlocutors found infuriating precisely because they could not easily refute it. He agreed that what the Night Lords did was terrible. He did not contest this point. He asked whether the Great Crusade itself was not built on the same foundation, whether the choice to bring worlds into compliance through overwhelming military force, to demand submission under threat of annihilation, to destroy those who refused to accept the Emperor's authority, was in its fundamental nature different from what the Night Lords did. He argued that the difference was one of scale and aesthetics rather than principle, that the Crusade was committed to the proposition that its ends justified its means, and that the Night Lords' means, however uncomfortable they were to contemplate, were in service of those same ends, pursued with honest acknowledgement of what they were rather than the comfortable self-deception of calling them something else. Sanguinius could not accept this. The argument was not, he said, a justification, but an attempt to make everyone equally culpable for the Night Lord's specific choices, and that was not the same thing as justification. And Curze knew it. He had chosen his methods. The Emperor had not asked him to crucify populations on their own walls. The crusade had not required atrocities beyond what the specific combat of compliance required. The Night Lords had chosen a path, and were now attempting to claim that the path was inevitable when it was not inevitable at all. It was the path of a legion that had been built from the worst of a world, and led by a Primarch who had decided that his worst was sufficient, and that the best was unnecessary. Curze heard this. The records suggest he heard it in both of the ways he heard things. As Konrad Curze, who could engage with the argument intellectually and find its merits and concede its accuracy on certain specific points. And as the Night Haunter, who was already calculating the shape of what came next. What the confrontation meant in the larger pattern of events that the visions had. He told Sanguinius that they were both right, that what the Night Lords did was terrible, and that the crusade was built on foundations that made terror inevitable, and that neither of those things could be separately true without making the other true as well. And then he told Sanguinius something that the records preserve in the Nostramo inflected High Gothic that Curze used when he wanted to make certain that what he said was heard precisely as he meant it. He told Sanguinius that the future had already been decided, and that Sanguinius's death, which was coming as certainly as his own, would prove which of them had understood the galaxy. Sanguinius left the ship. The confrontation was formally inconclusive, the kind of confrontation that resolves nothing and leaves everything at the same place it was, except that now all parties understand more clearly where they stand. But the accumulation continued. Other incidents, other operations, other moments where the Night Lords did what the Night Lords did, and the documentation of what they did arrived at Terror and was read by people who had to decide what to do about it and kept deciding to do nothing, which was a decision too, a decision with consequences that accumulated alongside the incidents. The censure, when it finally came, was delivered not with the formal weight of an imperial decree, but through the particular institutional mechanism that the crusade had for dealing with legions that had become a problem, which was to send another Primarch to the world of the problem and have the problem witnessed by sufficient force to make the response clear. The Night Lords were censured. Curze was told, in terms that admitted no ambiguity, that the methods his legion employed were unacceptable, and that continuation of those methods would result in consequences that the assembled authority of the crusade was prepared to enforce. He was told this by his brothers, in public, in the presence of his legion, in the way that authority communicates to those it is attempting to correct. Curze's response was not the response that authority anticipated. He did not accept the censure. He did not protest it formally or argue against it in the councils where such arguments were heard. He did what the Night Haunter did with things he could not accept and could not change, which is to say he continued exactly as before, without acknowledgement that the censure had occurred, until the continuation became an emergency and the emergency required a response more significant than another censure. He fled. He took his flagship and a core of the Legion and he left the systems where the Crusade's authority was immediately enforceable, and he went somewhere else. And there he continued to do what the Night Lords did, on worlds that were not currently under sufficient imperial observation to make the doing of it an immediate crisis. The records of this period are fragmentary, which may be because the Night Lords destroyed the records, or maybe because the machinery of imperial governance that kept records was not functioning in the specific regions where Curze was operating. Or maybe because some of the records were sealed by people who had reasons to prefer that they not be easily accessible. All three explanations are consistent with what is known. Likely all three are true in different proportions for different specific documents. What is known is that this period of exile, however brief or prolonged it actually was in objective time, changed something in the Night Lord's Legion's relationship to the authority it had been built to serve. Not because the Night Lords had ever been unreservedly enthusiastic about that authority. Exactly. Because they had not, but because the censure and the flight from censure formalized a position that had previously been operationally convenient to leave informal. After the censure, the Night Lords were the Legion that had been told they were doing it wrong, and had continued doing it anyway. After the flight, they were the Legion that had been told that they were unacceptable, and had responded by becoming more inaccessible rather than more acceptable. The gap between the Night Lords and the institutional crusade they nominally served had always been there. The censure had named it. The flight had widened it. When Horus came to Curze, when the War Master, who had already made his decisions and was already implementing them, reached out to the Night Haunter with the offer that he was making to every legion whose Primarch he believed he could bring into his rebellion, the conversation was different from the conversations Horus had with Lorgar or Mortarion, or Fulgrim, or any of the others. The others had been brought to their positions through specific mechanisms, through wounds the Chaos Gods had found and pressed, through theological revelation or military philosophy, or the slow corrosion of pride and resentment. Curze did not need to be brought anywhere. He was already where Horus was finding him. The visions had shown him where the crusade led. The censure had confirmed that his relationship to the crusade's authority was not what either party had originally pretended it was. He joined the rebellion not because chaos had corrupted him, not because Horus had offered him something he wanted, but because the rebellion was where the visions told him things were going. And Konrad Curze had learned, in the hard and specific way that Nostramo teaches everything, not to argue with what the visions showed him. This is the detail about the Night Lords that separates them from every other traitor legion in a way that matters enormously for understanding what they became and what they represent in the larger architecture of the Horus Heresy's consequences. They did not join the rebellion because they were servants of chaos. They were not. Curze was not a chaos worshipper. He did not offer devotion to the ruinous powers, or seek their gifts, or frame his decisions in the theological language of the primordial truth that Lorgar had discovered and was propagating among the legions he could reach. He joined the rebellion because his visions showed him that the rebellion was going to happen, and that the side that opposed it was going to lose. And he had decided, somewhere in the darkness of Nostramo, that the right response to a universe that produces only bad outcomes was to be on the side that at least had the honesty to admit it. This makes the Night Lord's horror uniquely structured. The word-bearers fell because they found something they believed in more than the Emperor. The World Eaters fell because their Primarch's rage was weaponized by powers that had been watching for exactly that weapon. The Death Guard fell because their virtue, their legendary endurance, was used against them by a god who understood how to turn the things people were best at into the instruments of their damnation. The Night Lords did not fall in any of these ways. The Night Lords joined the winning side as they understood it, and they did not particularly care about the spiritual or theological dimensions of the alignment they had made. They were not fighting for chaos. They were not fighting for the Emperor. They were fighting because fighting was what they did, and the side they were fighting on had seemed, when the choice was made, like the side that was going to win. They were wrong about this, as it turned out. But by the time they understood that they were wrong, wrong had become the only thing they knew how to be. The drop site massacre at Istvan V is one of those events whose scale is difficult to communicate without losing the specific horror of it in the general enormity. 3 legions descended onto a landing zone with the expectation of reinforcement. The reinforcements arrived and turned their weapons inward. Tens of thousands of Space Marines died in hours. The Night Lords were among the executioners, and they performed their role at Istvan V in the way that they performed everything, with a specific attention to the most terrible possible version of what was already a terrible thing. They did not simply kill. They made of Istvan V a message. The Night Lords understood with a practical competence that their entire doctrine was built on, that a massacre of this scale was an opportunity to communicate something that would outlast the massacre itself. The survivors who escaped the Urgal Depression, the warriors of the Raven Guard and the Iron Hands and the Salamanders who fought their way to orbit through circumstances that should not have permitted survival, carried with them not just the memory of what had happened, but the specific quality of the Night Lord's contribution to it. They had been hunted in ways that went beyond the mechanics of killing. They had been hunted by something that understood the structure of fear and was applying it deliberately in the middle of a massacre that was already the worst thing that most of them would ever experience. The Night Lords killed at Istvan V. They also performed at Istvan V in the precise theatrical sense of the word, because the performance was the weapon and the killing was incidental to it. What came after Istvan V is where the Night Lord's story in the Heresy diverges from the stories of the other traitor legions in ways that illuminate the specific character of what they were. The other traitor legions were deployed in the patterns that the rebellion's military logic demanded. They fought for Horus's strategic objectives. They participated in the larger operational calculus of a war for galactic domination. The Night Lords were deployed differently, or chose to operate differently, or some combination of both, according to sources that disagree on how much autonomy Curze claimed during this period. The Night Lords conducted a terror campaign, not in the strategic sense of a campaign designed to achieve specific military objectives through the targeted use of force, in the older and more elemental sense, the sense that does not have a military euphemism, the sense that simply describes what happens when a legion of Space Marines that has been building and refining and executing a doctrine of systematic psychological destruction for decades is unleashed on a galaxy that does not know how to process what is happening to it. They moved through sectors of the Imperium that had been loyal and were choosing in the first chaotic years of the Heresy to remain loyal, and they made those sectors understand the cost of that choice. The campaigns of the Night Lords during the Heresy are documented in fragments, because the Night Lords were thorough about many things and careless about and because many of the worlds they visited did not have anyone left afterward in sufficient condition to document what had happened there. What survives are accounts from survivors who escaped, from inquisitorial investigations conducted in the aftermath, from the testimonies of naval officers whose vessels had been in system when Night Lord's operations were conducted, and who had the particular fortune of being too far away to be directly affected, while being close enough. What those accounts describe is consistent in its general shape even where the specific details vary. They would arrive. They would make contact in ways that served the communication purpose before any military engagement occurred, ways designed to inform the population of what was coming, and to make the information as frightening as possible. The Night Lords understood that terror before violence is more effective than terror concurrent with violence, because the mind that is anticipating horror generates its own contribution to the horror, amplifying the actual event beyond what the actual event could produce on its own. They would leave things, objects, messages, evidence of their presence that confirmed they were there before there was any way to prepare for them being there. They operated in darkness when darkness was available, which in the void between stars and on the sunless or dim-lit worlds of the outer systems was often. Then they would move. And the specific nature of what happened when Night Lords moved through a defended position or an occupied city or a population center that had decided to resist them is the part of the accounts that the surviving witnesses struggled most to communicate. Not because they lacked words, because the words they had were the words for violence, and what the Night Lords did exceeded the category of violence in the same way that a flood exceeds the category of rain. Both are made of the same thing. The scale creates a difference in kind. Konrad Curze was not always present for these campaigns. He was fighting his own portion of the heresy, which brought him into contact with an opponent who was perhaps the only being in the galaxy capable of meeting him on terms that were genuinely equal. The Lion L. Johnson, Primarch of the Dark Angels, the First Legion, that cold and martial genius who had been absent from Terra's politics for long enough that his precise position in the heresy's early chaos was unclear to both sides. The Thramas Crusade, as the campaign was later designated, was the prolonged and brutal conflict between the Night Lords and the Dark Angels across the Thramas sector. And what made it remarkable among all the remarkable things that happened in the heresy was not the military complexity of it, though the military complexity was extraordinary, but the nature of the two beings at its center, the Lion and the Night Haunter. Two Primarchs, each in his way a creature of darkness, each capable of a kind of brutality that his brothers found disturbing, each operating under the constraint of a character that had been shaped by circumstances of extraordinary difficulty. But they were differently formed. The Lion's coldness was a fortress, a precision of emotion that served his military judgment by refusing to allow any specific thing to matter too much. Curze's darkness was something else, something that had started in the visions and had been deepened by Nostramo and had become, over decades, a specific kind of damage that manifested as a kind of perfect detachment from outcomes he could already see. They fought across the Thramas sector for years. Not continuously, not in the manner of a conventional campaign with front lines and logistics and all the ordinary apparatus of interstellar war. The Night Lords and the Dark Angels fought in the way that their respective natures demanded, which is to say, in the dark, in the sudden and specific moments of violence that resulted from intelligence and preparation rather than brute force, in the spaces where advantage could be constructed rather than simply applied. Curze was brilliant at this kind of war. The Lion, was better. He hunted Curze across the sector with the specific cold patience of a being who had learned on a world of monsters that the monster you were hunting was going to be found eventually as long as you did not give up the hunt. He applied the resources of the Dark Angels methodically, closing off the options that Curze had available, tightening the operational space in which the Night Lords could move, until the space was narrow enough that Curze could not maneuver out of the confrontation that the lion had been building toward. Curze was This is perhaps the most remarkable fact about the Thramas Crusade, that a Primarch was taken alive, that all the capability and the cunning and the specific terribleness that Konrad Curze brought to everything he did was insufficient to prevent a conclusion he had seen coming in his visions and had not managed to evade regardless. The capture was not bloodless. The lion did not take the Night Haunter easily or without cost. But the Night Haunter was taken, and what happened afterward reveals something about both Primarchs that the simpler narratives of traitor and loyalist cannot accommodate. He was taken to Macrage to reboot Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, who was attempting in the middle of the heresy to do what Guilliman always attempted, to create institutional structures that would outlast the crisis and provide a framework for whatever came after it. The confrontation between Curze and Guilliman is preserved in several accounts that agree on the general shape of it, while disagreeing on specific words, which suggests that the words are approximations of something that was witnessed and then described by people who had to translate what they witnessed into the vocabulary available to them. Guilliman argued for order. He made the case, in the terms that he made it better than anyone else in the Imperium, that civilization required law, and that law required authority, and that authority had to be maintained against those who would undermine it, or the entire structure dissolved into the kind of chaos that Nostramo represented. He argued that Curze's methods, whatever their short-term effectiveness, were incompatible with the long-term project of building something worth building. Curze's response was the response he had been developing since Nostramo. He asked Guilliman whether the Imperium was actually the kind of civilization that Guilliman's argument assumed it was, whether the institutions and the laws and the authorities that Guilliman was defending were actually the rational, beneficial structures Guilliman described, or whether they were at a level of analysis that Guilliman found uncomfortable to perform, simply the current version of what the Night Haunter had built on Nostramo. Fear with better furniture. Compliance purchased through the threat of overwhelming force rather than the more intimate threat of a figure in the darkness. He asked whether the difference between the Imperium and Nostramo was actually a difference in kind, or whether it was simply a difference in the scale at which the same fundamental operations were performed. Guilliman did not have an answer that satisfied the argument, though this was not because the argument was unanswerable. It was because Curze was not asking the question in good faith. He was not looking for an answer. He was demonstrating that the question could not be answered in a way that did not implicate the people asking it. And this was the demonstration he had been building toward his whole life, and the circumstances of the heresy had given him a stage on which to perform it. He escaped. The Night Haunter, who could not be kept anywhere he did not choose to be kept, eventually found the moment and took it, and was gone from Macrage as if he had never been there, which in the documentary record he largely had not. Because the circumstances of his captivity were not the kind of thing that the Ultramarines' records were eager to preserve in comprehensive detail. He returned to his legion, which had not dissolved without him, because the Night Lords did not require their Primarch's direct presence to continue being what they were. They continued being what they were. They continued the terror campaign across whatever portion of the galaxy they could reach. They continued killing and displaying and making examples and sending messages in the language they had always spoken. The language that Nostramo had taught them, and that they had refined into a military doctrine of singular effectiveness. And Curze continued receiving his visions, and the visions which had never lied to him in the way that everything else in his experience had lied to him, or if they lied, did so by omission rather than inversion, told him what the end of everything looked like, and he continued toward it with the particular quality of determination that comes not from hope, but from the absence of any other direction to go. The Night Lords at Istvan, on Thramas, across the terror campaigns of the Middle Heresy years, were not yet what they would become. They were still a legion in the formal sense, still operating with something like a command structure, still capable of coordinated action at a scale that required the organizational infrastructure of a legion to achieve. The character that would define them for 10,000 years was already present but not yet fully expressed. The expression would come later, after terror, after the long retreat into the spaces that the eye of terror could not quite reach, after the fracture of everything that the heresy's failure produced in each of the traitor legions. But the seeds of what came later were visible in what they did during the heresy. The Night Lord's specific brand of horror, the one that distinguishes them from the World Eater's blind rage, and the Emperor's children's perfect excess, and the Death Guard's relentless endurance, was visible in the gap between the scale of their violence and the aesthetic precision with which it was deployed. They were not simply killing. They were practicing an art form, and the art form was fear, and they practiced it with the dedication of artists who had decided that the only thing worth making was the thing they were best at, regardless of whether it was the thing the galaxy needed or the thing they themselves would have chosen in some other world where choices were genuinely available. Nostramo's destruction was not an accident. The Night Lords destroyed their own homeworld during the heresy, which is a fact that requires some explanation because it is the kind of fact that does not automatically explain itself. Why would a legion destroy the world that had made it? The answer, when you understand what Nostramo was and what it meant to the legion that came from it, is not difficult to find, but it is difficult to hold in mind, because it reveals something about the Night Lords that is uncomfortable in a specific way. Nostramo had been producing recruits for the Night Lords Legion since before the heresy, which meant that the population of warriors entering the legion from Nostramo were Nostramans, which meant they were products of a world that had never been reformed in any meaningful way. The Night Haunter's campaign of terror had imposed order on Nostramo, but it had imposed it through fear, and when the Night Haunter left, the fear diminished, and when the fear diminished sufficiently, Nostramo had reverted to what it was, because what it was not a civilization waiting to be better. It was a particular configuration of human darkness that the absence of a sufficient threat could express whenever the threat was removed. The recruits that Nostramo was producing by the Middle Heresy period were not simply warriors of poor moral character in the way that all Night Lords recruits were warriors of poor moral character. They were something worse. They were criminals of a quality so extreme that even the Night Lords' legion culture, which had never been characterized by excessive concern with the ethical dimensions of its members' natures, found them difficult to integrate. The Night Lords had always been brutal. The new Nostromans were something beyond brutal, something that the Legion's existing warriors found discomforting in the way that experienced practitioners of violence sometimes find the violence of the inexperienced discomforting, because it was uncontrolled and purposeless, and lacking even the functional justification of the doctrine the Legion had built around its own brutality. The Legion decided to end the problem at its source. The arguments within the leadership about this decision are not well documented, because the Night Lord's internal records from the Heresy period are fragmentary at best. But the decision was made. Night Lord's ships were positioned above Nostramo. Weapons were brought to bear on the world below, and Nostramo Quintus, the sunless world that had made everything the Night Lords were, was destroyed. The crews who carried out the orbital bombardment that cracked Nostramo's crust and shattered its geology into the kind of ruin that could not be rebuilt from, those crews were Nostromans themselves. This is the detail that the few detailed accounts of the event preserve with a consistency that suggests it matters. The men who killed their homeworld were the homeworld's sons. They were destroying the thing that had made them, which was also the thing that was producing the warriors who were making their Legion into something worse than what it had been. The moral and philosophical complexity of this act was not lost on the Night Lords who performed it. Nothing was ever lost on the Night Lords. They were nothing if not aware. What the destruction of Nostramo meant, beyond the immediate removal of the recruitment problem it was intended to solve, was that the Night Lords were now a legion without a home. Not in the metaphorical sense that the traitor legions were all exiled by the failure of the heresy. In the specific operational sense that there was no longer a world that produced Night Lords recruits. No population with the specific cultural background that Night Lord's culture had developed from. No baseline source for the gene seed's continuation. The Night Lords, after Nostramo's destruction, could only grow through the conversion of warriors from other populations, which meant warriors who did not share the specific Nostraman background that had given the Legion its character, and which meant that the character would inevitably drift as those warriors' influence accumulated over generations. This did not immediately matter. The Siege of Terror was coming, and in the immediate term the Night Lords had more pressing concerns than the long-term demographic implications of their homeworld's destruction. The Siege of Terror is the pivot point of the entire heresy, the event around which everything before it was preparation, and everything after it was consequence. The Night Lords participated, as all the traitor legions participated, in the campaign to bring the War Master's forces to bear on the Imperial Palace, and force the conclusion that Horus had been working toward since the War Master's wound on Davin, and the visions the Chaos Gods had used that wound to plant. The Night Lord's specific contribution to the siege was what the Night Lord's specific contribution to everything was. They were the dark thing in the periphery, the force that operated in the spaces between the main engagements, that made the experience of the defenders something that went beyond the ordinary horrors of siege warfare into the specific register of the Night Lord's art. They did terrible things during the siege. The records of what happened in the outer districts of the Imperial Palace complex, in the hab blocks and the tunnel networks and the spaces between the main defensive lines where the Night Lords found their preferred operational environment, are among the most sealed documents in the Inquisition's archives. What can be said without venturing into the specific details that those seals exist to suppress is that the Night Lords were effective, and that their effectiveness was of the kind that leaves marks on places and on populations that outlast the military engagement that produced them. But the siege ended wrong. The War Master died. The Emperor was broken, the traitor forces fragmented and fled. And the Night Lords, who had joined the rebellion not out of faith in Horus or in chaos, but out of Curze's conviction that his visions had told him the outcome, and that the outcome was Horus's victory, found themselves in the particular position of having been wrong about the thing they were most certain of. The visions, which had never lied to Curze in any obvious way, had produced a future that did not arrive. The war had ended differently from how it had been shown to him, or had been shown to him with the specific editorial selection that sometimes makes the truth misleading even when no individual element of it is false. The Night Lords retreated, not into the Eye of Terror in the way that the other traitor legions retreated, because the Night Lords had never been particularly interested in the Eye of Terror and what it offered, which was the proximity of the Chaos Gods whose patronage most of the traitor legions were now entirely dependent on. The Night Lords had no such dependence. They had no god. They had no patron. They had the darkness of the void between stars, and the specific capabilities of their legion, and the doctrine they had been practicing for decades. And those things were sufficient for what they intended to do, which was not what the other traitor legions intended to do. The other traitor legions, in their various ways, were planning their revenge. They were waiting in the Eye for the opportunity to renew the war, to bring a new Black Crusade to the galaxy that had defeated them, to pursue the objectives that the heresy had failed to achieve. The Night Lords were not planning revenge. The Night Lords did not plan anything in the way that implies a positive vision of a desired future. They planned only in the way that applies to the next immediate operation, the next planet to be raided, the next sector of space to move through, the next example to be made. They were not fighting to win anything. They had stopped believing in winning somewhere in the darkness before the heresy or during it, and they were now simply doing what they did because it was the only thing they knew how to be. They scattered, not completely, not all at once, but progressively, over the years and decades after the heresy's failure, as the organizational structures that had maintained legion coherence became harder to maintain without the resources and the homeworld and the institutional infrastructure that a legion required to function. Warbands formed. The Night Lords of the early post-heresy period were still capable of operating in formations large enough to be called company scale. By the late 41st millennium, most Night Lords operations were conducted by forces that the Codex Astartes, which was itself not the Night Lord's governing document, would have classified as patrol strength or less. But before all of that, before the long fracture into warbands, and the 10 millennia of real space raiding, and the gradual erosion of everything the Legion had been except the specific methodology of terror that proved immune to erosion, there was the death of Konrad Curze. He found his world, Sagualsa, a dead and dark place at the edge of the Emperor's children's domain in the eye-adjacent regions of space, was where Curze had gone when the heresy ended, and the retreat began. He had made of Sagualsa a palace, or what passed for a palace when the being creating it was the Night Haunter, which is to say a structure that expressed in stone and shadow and deliberate arrangement the specific quality of what the Night Haunter was. Dark, deliberately dark, A palace that looked like it had been built by something that needed darkness the way other things needed light, that had arranged its spaces around the specific quality of dark rather than adding darkness as an aesthetic choice to rooms that were fundamentally about other things. He had dismissed his guards. The records of his final days on Sagualsa, such records as exist, which are incomplete in ways that may be deliberate or may simply be a consequence of the fact that the people around him in those days were not the kind of people who kept careful records, suggest that he had been preparing for what was coming. Not preparing to prevent it, preparing to receive it. He dismissed his guards in stages, over days or weeks, until he was alone in his dark palace with only the visions for company, and the visions showed him what was coming and when. The Emperor had sent an assassin, Meshen, a Collidus assassin, one of those agents of the Officio Assassinorum whose training and surgical modification and specific capabilities made them effective against targets that conventional military force could not reach without prohibitive cost. She had been sent with a warrant that was, by the standards of the operations the Officio conducted, entirely straightforward: find the Night Haunter and kill him. The complexity of the operation was not in the objective but in the execution, because Konrad Curze was not an ordinary target, and Sagualsa was not an ordinary location. She reached him. This in itself says something about either the Calidus's capability or the Night Haunter's deliberate cooperation with the approach, because the Night Haunter was not someone who failed to notice things he was paying attention to. He had made his preparations. He was waiting. The accounts of the final confrontation between the Night Haunter and the Calidus assassin who killed him are based on a small number of sources, the most significant of which is an account that was recovered from Sagualsa by a subsequent expedition, and that purports to be a record of what Meshen found, and what she reported to the Officio Assassinorum afterward. The account has been questioned, authenticated, questioned again, and eventually placed in a category of documents whose authenticity is sufficiently uncertain that drawing firm conclusions from any specific element of it is inadvisable, but whose general shape is consistent with everything else that is known about Curze's state in his final period. He was sitting in the dark when she found him, not hiding, not preparing to fight, sitting in the way that someone sits who has decided that this is the moment and that there is nothing to be done about the moment except to be in it. He had known she was coming. He told her this. He had seen her coming in his visions for longer than she had been assigned the mission, which meant he had seen the Emperor's decision before the Emperor had communicated it, which was the kind of foreknowledge that the visions provided with a regularity that had never stopped being disturbing to those who witnessed its expressions. He asked her something. The accounts differ on what exactly he asked, but the general shape of the question is consistent across the versions that survive. He asked whether the Emperor had known, not whether the Emperor had sent her, which was obvious. Whether the Emperor had known, from the beginning, from the first moment of their meeting on Nostramo, that this was how the story ended. Whether the Emperor, who was himself not without gifts of foresight, had seen from the beginning the specific arc of Konrad Curze's existence, and had chosen, with that knowledge, to deploy the Night Lords, and use their capabilities, and accept the things those capabilities required, until the capabilities were no longer useful, and then to send the assassin. She did not answer the question. The account suggests she was not capable of answering it, not because she lacked the information, but because the question was not a question that had an answer she could provide, and she understood that the question was not actually directed at her, but at the absence behind her. the Emperor on his damaged throne who was not present to receive it. He let her kill him. This is the most significant single fact about the Night Haunter's death. The thing that makes it different from the deaths of other Primarchs, and that gives it its specific philosophical weight. He did not fight. He did not use any of the considerable capabilities that a Primarch possesses, capabilities that would have made killing him, even for a Colidus, an enormously more difficult undertaking than what actually occurred. He had dismissed his guards. He had waited in the dark. He had asked his question. And then he let her kill him. He said something before she did it. The accounts agree on this, that there was a statement, and they agree on what the statement was, or close enough to it that the core meaning is clear. He said that death is nothing compared to vindication. And then the Calidus did her work, and Konrad Curze, the Night Haunter, the Primarch of the Night Lord's Legion, the statement is the argument in compressed form. All the philosophical debates, all the confrontations with Sanguinius and Guilliman and the Lion, all the long campaign of terror that had been his contribution to the galaxy's history, compressed into a single assertion. Death is nothing compared to vindication. The Emperor had sent an assassin to kill him, not a military force. Not the formal judicial process of a civilization that believed in law and order and the institutional resolution of the conflicts between its members. An assassin, operating in secret, in the dark without warning, killing a sleeping target who had no opportunity to respond or resist or even know that the decision had been made. The Emperor had used, against his own son, the specific method that Konrad Curze had built his entire career around. The method that the confrontation on Nostramo and the censure and the debates in the Thramas years had framed as something the Crusade did not do, something that distinguished the Emperor's project from the Night Haunters. And Curze was right that this was what had happened. Whether he was right that it proved his larger argument is a different question. The kind of question that the philosophical tradition of the Imperium is not equipped to answer without implicating itself in precisely the way Curze intended. But he was right that the Emperor had sent an assassin. He was right that the method was the same as differing in scale and in the identity of the target, and in the institutional context in which it was performed, but not in kind. He had argued this for decades, and the end of his life proved that the argument was not wrong, whatever else might be wrong with the conclusions he had drawn from it. He chose his death. This is what makes the Night Haunter's death something other than simply a significant military event. Something that sits in the tradition of 40K's great tragedies alongside the fall of the legions and the breaking of the Primarchs and all the other moments where the gap between what humanity aspired to and what humanity was became briefly, terribly visible. He chose it. He had the power to prevent it, and he chose not to. And the reason he chose not to was that preventing it would have meant denying the argument, accepting that the Emperor's method was different from his, conceding the point that he had been making since the darkness of Nostramo. And Konrad Curze did not concede points. He was made of his argument in a way that made the argument and the man inseparable, so that the only way the argument could be completed was in the way he chose to complete it. The Night Lords received the news of their Primarch's death in whatever way news travelled among a legion that was already beginning its long fracture into something that could not be called a legion in the full organizational sense. They received it differently than other legions received the deaths of their Primarchs. because the Night Lord's relationship to Curze had been different from other legions' relationships to their Primarchs. The Night Lords did not love their Primarch in the uncomplicated way that some legions loved their founders. They had understood him, which in the Night Lord's emotional vocabulary was the nearest thing to love that the legion possessed. They understood what he had been, and why he had made the choices he had made, and what those choices had cost. And they understood, with the particular quality of understanding that the Night Lords brought to everything, that his death was the last act of a performance that had been running his entire life. They continued the performance. What else could they do? The Night Haunter was gone. Nostramo was gone. The heresy was failed. The Legion was beginning the long process of breaking into fragments that would eventually operate independently in the void between stars, preying on the shipping lanes and the isolated worlds and the vulnerable outposts of an Imperium that was trying to rebuild itself after the damage the heresy had done to it. The Night Lords continued because continuing was the only motion they knew. And the motion was the same motion it had always been, the motion toward fear and darkness, and the specific kind of communication that only terror makes possible. The Night Lords of the 10,000 years that followed the heresy are not a story that lends itself to conventional narrative structure, because conventional narrative structure implies progress, implies movement toward or away from something, implies that the events described are building toward a conclusion. The Night Lords' 10 millennia have no such structure. They are a pattern that repeats in variations, the same basic action performed across the galaxy's vast dark spaces with the same basic purpose and the same basic outcomes. And the horror of it is less in any specific iteration of the pattern than in the pattern itself, in the specific quality of existence that the pattern represents. They raid. This is, in the broadest possible summary, what the Night Lords do in the millennia after the heresy. They emerge from the darkness of the void, which in the Night Lords' operational tradition is not a poetic description but a practical one, because they operate in the dark regions of the galaxy, in the spaces between star systems and in the outer reaches of systems, whose inhabited worlds have no realistic capacity to call for help quickly enough for help to arrive. They raid these places and they kill and they take what they need and they leave what they do not. And what they leave is the specific impression that the Night Lords have always left wherever they operate. The impression of something that could return at any moment, from any direction, and that cannot be appealed to, or reasoned with, or given something in exchange for not returning. They do not primarily inhabit the Eye of Terror. This is the specific distinguishing feature of the Night Lords among the major traitor legions, the thing that shapes the texture of their existence in the post-heresy period in ways that differ fundamentally from the World Eaters, or the Death Guard, or the Thousand Suns, or any of the other legions that retreated into the Eye and made their daemon world fortresses and their terrible kingdoms in the warp-soaked space around the Cadian Gate. The Night Lords are a real space threat, which means they are an immediate and unpredictable threat to the ordinary working fabric of the Imperium in ways that eye-based legions are not. An eye-based threat can, in principle, be monitored. The Eye of Terror has a shape, and that shape can be watched, and Black Crusades are significant events that generate the kind of strategic warning that allows the Imperium to marshal the response they require. A Night Lord's warband in the outer darkness of the segmentum obscurus is not a strategic threat in the same sense. It is a knife in the dark. It does not announce its approach. It does not require the opening of a warp rift or the mobilization of a million-strong army. It requires only the absence of adequate light, which is the condition that most of the galaxy most of the time finds itself in. They fragmented, but not into nothing. The Night Lord's fragmentation was a process that took time and produced something that was neither fully intact nor entirely dissolved. Warbands formed around figures who commanded sufficient personal authority and sufficient military capability to maintain the loyalty, or at least the functional compliance, of the warriors around them. These figures were not Primarchs and did not attempt to be. They were captains and champions and the various categories of leader that Space Marine culture produces in the absence of the formal hierarchy that gives rank its meaning. They operated their warbands with different degrees of competence and different specific flavors of the Night Lord's general doctrine. But the doctrine itself persisted because it was not a product of organization. It was a product of culture and of gene seed and of 10,000 years of reinforcing practice. The gene seed matters. The Night Lord's gene seed is the physical inheritance from Konrad Curze's, the biological code that determines the specific shape of the transformation that turns human recruits into Night Lords. And it has its own characteristics that the post-heresy gene seed has preserved imperfectly but consistently enough to matter. The Night Lords see in the dark better than any other Space Marine legion. Their visual acuity under low light conditions is extraordinary in the specific way that Nostramo's perpetual murk demanded from anyone who wanted to function there. This is not a tactical gift exactly, because night vision can be replicated by technology, but it is a gift whose significance is symbolic as much as practical. The Night Lords are made for the dark. The gene seed says so. The visual organs that Curze's genetics produce in his sons are the biology of a being designed to operate where the light is insufficient for ordinary eyes, which is a description of most of the universe, most of the time. The corruption that proximity to the Chaos Gods has inflicted on many Night Lords is a complication in the story of their post-heresy existence that requires some care to address. Because the Night Lord's relationship to chaos is genuinely different from that of the other traitor legions, and collapsing the distinction obscures something important. Most traitor legions serve their patron Chaos Gods with varying degrees of ideological commitment. The World Eaters, whatever they were before the Butcher's Nails and Angron's apotheosis, are now in practice the servants of Khorne. Their existence oriented around the killing that Khorne demands in the same way that the Death Guard's existence is oriented around the decay that Nurgle embodies. The Thousand Sons served Siench's purposes even when Magnus's sorcerous plans diverge from those purposes in ways that Siench presumably finds amusing. The Emperor's children have given themselves to Slaanesh so thoroughly that the distinction between what Slaanesh wants and what the Emperor's children want has ceased to be legible. The Night Lords do not have a patron. This is not an oversight. It is a position, a specific and deliberate refusal to submit to the kind of chaos patronage that the other traitor legions accepted. And the refusal has consequences for what the Night Lords are that ripple through everything about their post-heresy existence. They are not animated by a Chaos God's purpose. They are not the instrument of any will beyond their own. They are not seeking the gifts of transformation and empowerment that the Chaos Gods offer to devoted servants, gifts that in the Night Lords' practical evaluation come with prices that make the benefits insufficient. They fight for themselves, which in the Night Lord's vocabulary means they fight because fighting is the only mode of existence they have known for 10,000 years and the only one they know how to inhabit. Some Night Lords have taken chaos marks. The proximity of the warp that their real space raiding still exposes them to, the daemon world ports they use, the eye-adjacent regions where they sometimes operate, has inflicted mutations on some Night Lord's warriors that they did not request and cannot entirely refuse. The cultural response to this varies by warband and by individual. Some Night Lords accept the marks with the pragmatic acknowledgement that fighting what cannot be fought is wasteful. Some Night Lords, particularly those whose pride in the Legion's pre-heresy identity is strongest, resist the marks with a specific intensity that is one of the more counterintuitive features of their character. Space Marines, who have committed 10,000 years of atrocity in the void, maintaining a specific point of pride about not submitting to the powers that their atrocity technically serves. The Night Lords that refuse Chaos's gifts have a particular relationship to what they are that is, in its own way, more disturbing than the straightforwardly damned warriors of the other traitor legions. A World-Eater champion who has been transformed by Khorne's gifts into something barely recognizable as the Space Marine he once was has, at least, the coherence of a thing that has fully committed to what it is. The Night Lord who refuses mutation, who maintains the original form of a Night Lord's legionary, who still wears the lightning bolt and the skull and wings iconography of the 8th Legion, who still calls himself by the Nostramo honorifics that the Legion used in the Great Crusade, is maintaining a form that has no content to put in it. He is a Night Lord without a Night Lord's Legion to belong to, without a Primarch to serve, without a homeworld to recruit from, without the institutional structures that give identity its meaning, maintaining the form of an identity as a kind of protest against the dissolution of everything that the identity was built around. They are aware of this. The Night Lords, individually and in whatever passes for their collective self-understanding, are almost universally aware of what they are, and what they have lost, and what they are doing when they do what they do. This awareness, which is the most genuinely unusual feature of the Night Lords, in comparison to other traitor legions, is what makes Talos Valkoran's story so significant as a document of the Night Lords' post-heresy existence. The accounts of the 10th Company, and specifically the warrior known as Talos, the Soul Hunter, are the closest thing the Night Lords' post-heresy era has to an internal perspective. A record from inside the experience of being what a Night Lord is in the 10,000-year exile from everything the Legion was. The accounts were not produced for the purposes of military documentation or imperial intelligence. They were produced by a warrior who was himself a Night Lord, who shared fully in everything that made the Night Lords what they were, and who had the specific quality of self-awareness that the Night Lords generally possessed, but who had additionally the quality of articulation, the ability to say what he saw when he looked at his own existence. That made his observations useful as something other than purely internal experience. Talos was a prophet, or something that functioned like a prophet, in the specific sense that the Night Lord's genetic heritage produced in some of its members the capacity for visions that had always characterized Konrad Curze's existence. Not universally. Not in every Night Lord. but in those in whom the gene seed's psychic legacy expressed fully. The visions came. They came to Talos as they had come to Curze, with the specific, terrible precision of information that cannot be ignored and cannot be changed, showing futures that would arrive regardless of what the person seeing them chose to do in response. He had been one of Curze's personal warriors, part of the Night Haunter's inner circle in the final years before Tsagualsa, and he had seen enough of Curze directly to understand what Curze had been, in a way that the historical record alone cannot produce. He carried that understanding into the centuries that followed Curze's death, and it shaped everything about how he experienced the Night Lord's post-heresy existence, which was the experience of being a remnant of something that had ended, and was now continuing on momentum rather than purpose. His company was the collection of warriors who had found themselves orbiting his specific capability and his specific quality of leadership, which was not the kind of leadership that inspires devotion or commands authority through personal charisma. It was the kind of leadership that functions through competence, and through the specific respect that the Night Lord's culture gave to those who were genuinely good at the things the Night Lords valued, which were raiding and killing, and the specific psychological arts that made raiding and killing effective beyond the immediate military dimensions of those activities. He was good at all of it. He was also aware that being good at all of it was not the same as having a reason to be good at it. And that distinction was something he lived with in ways that other Night Lords either did not perceive or had chosen not to examine. Around him were warriors who embodied different aspects of what the Night Lords had become and were becoming. Zal was the ideal Night Lord's warrior in the traditional sense, the embodiment of what Nostramo's darkness had always been building toward: enormous capability, complete comfort with violence, and a specific quality of pride in the Legion's heritage that expressed itself as contempt for the chaos corrupted and the undisciplined, and the warriors of other traitor legions who had surrendered their identity to their patron powers. He fought with the specific pride of someone who believed that what he was doing mattered, even if the mattering was predicated on standards that had no external referent anymore. Uzaz was what happened when the Night Lord's relationship to restraint was fully dissolved, when the cultural framework that the Legion had maintained even in its most terrible operations was simply gone. He had been a functioning Night Lord once, capable of the discipline that the Legion's doctrine required, and over the centuries the discipline had eroded, and what was left was the violence without the context, the killing without the communication purpose that justified it within the Legion's own self-understanding. The Night Lords were not random killers. Their violence was always supposed to be in service of fear, which required an audience, which required the preservation of enough of the target population to receive the message. Uzaz had lost the ability to maintain this distinction. He killed everything that was available to be killed. He was the Night Lords at their extreme, the end point of what the Legion's basic drives produced when all the cultural and doctrinal governors were removed. Varial the Flayed was a different category of Night Lord altogether, a former apothecary of the Red Corsairs, who had come to the 10th Company through circumstances that illustrated the Night Lord's post-heresy position in the galaxy's larger ecology of chaos and piracy and real space violence. He was a craftsman, in the specific and disturbing way that Night Lords understood craftsmanship, with a relationship to the body and its possibilities that reflected the Night Lord's aesthetic appreciation of what fear required and what violence could be made to mean. He was also a man with his own history and his own specific damage and his own relationship to the questions of what he was doing, and why that had been answered differently from how Talos answered them, not more cheerfully, but with less unresolved grief. What Talos represents in the larger story of the Night Lords is the specific quality of self-awareness that makes the Night Lords uniquely disturbing among the traitor legions. The World Eaters are not asking what they are. They know what they are, and what Khorne has made them, and the question does not arise in any form that causes them trouble, because the Butcher's nails have removed the part of the mind where the question would normally form. The Death Guard have Nurgle's equanimity, that strange acceptance of what they have become that reads as peace to those who cannot see that the peace is the disease. The Thousand Suns have their sorcery and their plans, and the infinite distractions that Tzeentch provides to prevent them from sitting still long enough to ask the question clearly. The Night Lords have nothing to distract them. They have no patron's gifts and no patron's purposes. They have nothing to do in the void between raids except be what they are in the full light of their own self-knowledge. And what they are is something that the fullest possible understanding of does not make better, and does not make more acceptable, and does not resolve into any kind of peace. They know what they have done. They know what they are, and they continue, because continuing is the only direction the Night Lords have, and it always has been. Talos knew that his company would not endure. The visions told him, not in the way of predictions that could be interpreted optimistically, not in the way of futures that could be shaped through choices made in the present, in the way that the Night Haunter's visions had always worked, showing the future with the fixed certainty of a fact waiting to be experienced in sequence. His company would fragment, his warriors would die in their various ways, through the violence that the real space raiding they lived by constantly exposed them to, through the internal conflicts that the Night Lord's culture made inevitable when the institutional structures that normally manage such conflicts were no longer present. He would die. He had seen it. He continued. The continuation was not hope. It was the motion of a thing that is still moving, because it has not yet stopped. And stopping required a reason not to continue, and the Night Lords have never had a reason not to continue, because the Night Lords have never had a reason to do anything other than what they do. This is the shape of the Night Lord's existence in the 41st millennium. Warbands in the dark, raiding the shipping lanes and the isolated settlements, and the worlds that are not quite isolated enough to be left alone, but not well connected enough to receive help in time. Applying the doctrine that Nostramo produced and Konrad Curze systematized and 10,000 years of practice has refined to the point of instinct. Making examples. Sending messages in the language that the Night Lords have always spoken. The language that has no alphabet and no grammar and no literature except the specific literature of terror. The bodies arranged to communicate, the sounds made in the dark to ensure that the population that hears them will not sleep without knowing that it has heard them. And fighting each other, because that too is part of the pattern. The Night Lord's warbands are not unified by anything except the gene seed they share and the heritage they remember. And neither of those things is sufficient to produce cooperation when the operational requirements of a specific situation make conflict between warbands more advantageous than collaboration. They fight each other. They betray each other. They absorb each other's resources and sometimes each other's warriors in the specific way that the void ecology of the traitor legions produces when the institutional structures that prevent intra-factional violence are gone. They are not building toward anything. This is the most important distinction between the Night Lords and the enemies of the Imperium who have ambitions of galactic conquest, or chaos victory, or the undoing of the Emperor's work. The Night Lords are not building. They never were, not even in the Heresy, not even on Nostramo. They were making a point. They were demonstrating something. Curze's entire existence was an argument, and the Night Lord's existence after his death was the continuation of the argument without the arguer. The demonstration of his thesis without anyone to explain what was being demonstrated. What is being demonstrated is this, that the galaxy is dark, and the darkness produces things like the Night Lords, and the things the darkness produces will continue regardless of what the light does, because the light is insufficient to the darkness and has always been insufficient. And the gap between what the light promises and what it delivers is the specific space in which the Night Lords operate. They are not wrong about this. The galaxy is dark. The Imperial Creed and its promises of the Emperor's protection and the Astronomican's guiding light and the armies of the faithful holding the darkness back are, in the specific regions of space where the Night Lords operate, demonstrably insufficient. The darkness remains. The Night Lords remain in it. And the worlds that find Night Lords in their darkness find also the specific message that the Night Lords have always delivered, which is that the light did not come and the darkness did. The message is accurate. It is always accurate. The Night Lord's only consistent accuracy is the demonstration that the darkness is real and the light's reach is limited. What does this mean for the wider galaxy? What does the existence of the Night Lords tell us about the Warhammer 40,000 universe that the other traitor legions do not tell in the same way? The other traitor legions are stories about corruption, about things that were good becoming bad, about the Chaos God's patient exploitation of human weakness, and the specific shapes that exploitation takes when it reaches different kinds of beings. They are cautionary tales in the structure that cautionary tales typically have, with a clear before and a clear after, and a specific turn that transforms one into the other. The Night Lords are not a cautionary tale. The Night Lords are the question behind every cautionary tale. The question of whether the darkness that cautionary tales warn against is a product of specific failures and specific corruptions, or whether it was always there, in the foundations, in the nature of what the galaxy is, and what it produces when it has enough time and enough pressure, and enough absence of light. Konrad Curze did not fall from something better. He was made in the dark from the beginning. The Night Lords were recruited from the worst of Nostramo, which was the worst, because Nostramo was what it was, which was what humanity produced when it settled a world with insufficient light and told the people on it to survive. They were never something else that became this. They were always this. And the argument Curze made, that the Imperium is built on the same foundations, that the compliance through fear that the Night Lords practiced with full acknowledgement is the same compliance through fear that the Imperium practices while calling it something else, is an argument that the Imperium has never successfully answered. It has suppressed the argument, sealed the records that document it most clearly, sent assassins when the argument became sufficiently inconvenient in sufficiently visible ways. But suppression is not refutation. And the Night Lords, in their real space raiding, in their 10,000 years of darkness and terror, and the continuation of a pattern that began on a world without adequate sunlight, are the ongoing demonstration that the argument has not been answered. The Imperium fears the Night Lords specifically, not with the strategic dread of an existential threat, the way the Tyranids are feared or the way a major Black Crusade concentrates military attention. The Night Lords are not that kind of threat. They do not have the numbers for that kind of threat, and they have not had since the heresy. And the fragmentation of the millennia since has reduced their collective military capability further. The Imperium fears the Night Lords in the more personal and immediate way, the way that something fears a thing that could be in its house, could be in any house, could be anywhere the light is insufficient, which is anywhere the light is not specifically maintained and specifically sufficient, which is most places. The Night Lords are the Dark's native population. They belong to it in a way that the rest of the galaxy, which was built to aspire to the light even if it could not always reach it, does not. They are what Nostramo produced, which is what the Dark produces when it is given enough time and enough human material to work with. They are the specific and terrible proof that the things that built the galaxy's darkness were not aberrations. They were the natural result. That is the full horror of the Night Lords. Not the specific atrocities, though the atrocities are real and their scale across 10,000 years is beyond meaningful calculation. Not the terror campaigns or the crucified populations or the specific terrible messages written in the idiom that fear speaks. Not even the death of Konrad Curze and the argument he made with that death, and the question it leaves for anyone honest enough to look directly at the answer. The full horror is simpler than any of those specific things. It is that the Night Lords are not wrong about the dark. The dark is real. The light is insufficient, and in the space between what the light promises and what it can actually deliver, something will always be waiting that knows the dark better than anything the light has produced. That was always the Night Lord's message. That was always Nostramo's lesson. And the lesson has not been learned in 10,000 years, which means it will not be learned by a galaxy that is currently, in the era of the Cicatrix Maledictum and the Great Rift and the Noctis Eterna that has swallowed half the Imperium's worlds in genuine and absolute darkness, uniquely positioned to receive it. The Night Lords are waiting. They were made for this. They have always been made for this. And in the darkness that is coming, the darkness that the galaxy has been building toward since the moment the first human soul reached the warp and gave the darkness something to feed on, the Night Lords are the most honest thing in the void. Not the most terrible, the most honest. They have always known what the dark is. They have always known what it contains. They were born in it, and they have never been other than what it made them, and they will continue to be that, until the light either grows sufficient or is finally extinguished entirely. Either way, they will be there, in the dark, where they belong. Doing what they do, waiting for the moment when another world in the outer reaches of the Imperium finds that its calls for help are not answered quickly enough, and the darkness it had been hoping was empty turns out to contain something that has been watching it long before it knew anything was watching. Hail the Lord of the Night. He is dead. The night is not. The specific quality of the Night Lord's real space existence, the texture of what it means to be a Night Lord's warband in the void of the 41st millennium, is something that the broader strategic accounts of Traitor Legion activity cannot adequately convey. The broad strokes are familiar enough from the pattern. Emerge from dark space, locate a target, apply doctrine, withdraw before a significant military response can be organized. The texture is something different. The texture is what happens in the spaces within that pattern, the long transits between raids, the relationships among warriors who have been killing alongside each other for centuries, the specific culture that a force maintains when the institutional structures that normally sustain culture are absent, and the only maintenance available is what the warriors themselves provide. Night Lords' warbands exist in a state that the military analysts of the Inquisition have described as sustainable predation. They are self-sufficient in the specific and predatory sense that they take what they need from whatever they encounter. Ships captured from raided convoys, supplies taken from raided settlements, warriors recruited occasionally from populations that produce individuals capable of receiving the Night Lord's gene seed, which in the current era is rarer than it once was, and the process of selection less careful than it was on Nostramo, but which continues because the warbands require continuity, and continuity requires new warriors, and new warriors require gene seed to mate. The quality of these recruits is inconsistent. The Night Lords do not have the luxury of the Nostraman selection process, which for all its moral bankruptcy was effective at producing a specific kind of warrior. They make do with what the void provides. What this produces, in the warbands that have been operating independently for centuries, is a force whose oldest members remember things that its newest members have never experienced, and can only understand as legend. The Night Lords who fought at Istvan Fee, the dwindling number who still live because space marine physiology and warp exposure have combined to extend the natural lifespan of a being who was already biologically extraordinary, carry with them the memory of what the Legion was in its full expression, what 10,000 space marines moving in coordinated purpose under a Primarch's direct command looked like and felt like from the inside. The recruits of the 41st millennium have never seen anything of that scale. They have known only the warband, the isolated vessel, the raid, the long transit, the next target selected from the navigational information accumulated from the previous raid's intelligence gathering. They are Night Lords in heritage and gene seed and cultural transmission. They are something reduced from what the Legion was in ways that the reduction itself conveys meaning about what 10,000 years of fragmentary existence does to even the most resilient of traditions. The Covenant of Blood. The phrase appears in various Night Lords accounts across the period, sometimes as the name of a specific warband, sometimes as a designation for a loose alliance of warbands that operated in the same region of space with sufficient frequency that coordination had become practical, sometimes as a more abstract concept, the kind of covenant that all Night Lords implicitly share by virtue of their shared heritage and gene seed, and the unspoken acknowledgement that they are the remnants of something that no longer exists in the form that would give the remnants their full meaning. In whatever form the phrase is used, it refers to the specific quality of Night Lord solidarity that persists despite the fracture. The recognition among dispersed and individually operating warbands that they are fragments of the same thing, and that the recognition produces obligations that function even in the absence of the institutional structures that would normally produce and enforce those obligations. Night Lords help other Night Lords, sometimes not reliably. Not in the way that genuine trust produces reliable cooperation, but in the way that beings who understand each other completely sometimes help each other despite having no specific reason to and no institutional compulsion to do so. Because the understanding is itself a kind of bond, and the bond produces behavior that functions like loyalty without being loyalty in any technically precise sense. This is more generous than the Night Lords deserve on the evidence of specific incidents where Warband has turned on Warband, where Night Lords have sold information about other Night Lords' operations to Imperial Navy commanders who would use it against them, where the predatory logic of void survival has produced betrayals among people who would seem to share too much to find betrayal practical. But the generous reading is also not entirely wrong. The Night Lords are, in their way, consistent. They are consistently themselves. And being themselves includes, in some expressions, the kind of mutual recognition that being the sole surviving speakers of a language produces among those who still remember it. The raids themselves have a specific quality that the Night Lords have refined across 10 millennia, and that their targets consistently report in ways that converge on the same set of features regardless of the specific warband or the specific target or the specific century. It is the anticipation. The Night Lords understand, and have always understood, that the fear before violence is more powerful than the violence itself. That a population that knows something is coming and cannot stop it or escape it or appeal to anything that might protect it, generates its own contribution to the experience in ways that the Night Lords can exploit without any additional expenditure of effort. The anticipation is not a side effect of Night Lords raiding. It is a primary weapon, cultivated deliberately, introduced before any physical contact is made, sustained through the raid and past it, because the Night Lords' objective is never simply to take what they need. It is to leave something behind that persists after they are gone. They are theatre practitioners in the most specific and technically rigorous sense. Warriors who have thought seriously about audience, about message, about the relationship between what is done and what is perceived and what is communicated, and what persists in the memory of those who experienced it or witnessed it or heard it described by those who experienced it. The Night Lords understand that an action's impact extends beyond its immediate victims, that the appropriate calibration of how an action is performed and displayed and communicated can extend its effective range dramatically beyond the physical boundaries of the action itself. A settlement of 10,000 that is raided by Night Lords does not only teach 10,000 people to be afraid, it teaches everyone those people will ever tell about it. It teaches the system it is located in. It teaches the trade routes that pass near it. It teaches the sector, if the telling reaches that far, which with sufficient cultivation of the aesthetic presentation of the raid it sometimes does. The Night Lords have always known that they are working with a medium. The medium is human perception, specifically human fear, specifically the subset of human fear that responds to the presence of something genuinely threatening in ways that disable rational response, and replace it with the specific paralysis that terror produces. They are artists in that medium in the way that a painter is an artist in the medium of paint. Which is to say that the medium itself has properties and limitations and specific possibilities that must be understood before they can be exploited. And that mastery of the medium consists not in ignoring those properties, but in understanding them so thoroughly that they become tools rather than constraints. The Night Lords of the 41st millennium are not as accomplished in this art as the Night Lords of the Great Crusade. Because the Night Lords of the Great Crusade had Legion scale resources and Primarch level direction and 10,000 warriors who could be deployed in coordinated expressions of the doctrine that no warband scale force can replicate. But the art has not been entirely lost. The technique persists. The fundamental understanding persists, and what has been lost in scale has sometimes been compensated for in intensity, in the specific quality of violence that warriors who have been doing this for 10,000 years bring to it, who have refined the practice until the unnecessary has been eliminated, and what remains is only the essential. The relationship between the Night Lords and the Chaos Gods in the 41st millennium is more complicated than the simple refusal that characterized Curze's position and the early post-heresy period's explicit stance. 10,000 years of operating in the warp-adjacent spaces of the galaxy, of the inevitable exposure that raiding in those spaces produces, has changed the Night Lords in ways that the Night Lords themselves have varying positions on. The warbands that have most thoroughly resisted mutation and chaos influence are not uniform in their reasons for the resistance. Some resist because they believe in the way that Night Lords believe things, which is with the specific conviction of beings who have thought about their position and arrived at it through reason rather than faith. That submission to chaos patronage would make them into something that is not the Night Lords, that the marks of the Chaos Gods would replace the identity that the Night Lords still maintain with an identity that is determined by the patron rather than the warrior, and that this is unacceptable on the same grounds that it was always unacceptable. Some resist because their Primarch resisted, and they were made from his gene seed, and his resistance was built into the gene seed in ways that persist beyond his death and beyond the theological position he articulated, and into the specific biological architecture of what it means to be a Night Lord. Curze was not a chaos worshipper. His gene seed is not a chaos worshipper's gene seed. The warriors made from it carry something of his refusal in their bodies, in the way that all gene seed carries something of the Primarch who originated it. And that bodily refusal expresses itself as resistance in ways that the warriors themselves may not fully understand. Some Night Lords have fallen to chaos anyway. Some have accepted marks that change them in ways they did not anticipate or consent to in the full sense of consent that requires complete knowledge of the transformation's final shape. Some have been changed by the warp without any choice in the matter at all, because operating near the eye for 10 millennia means being exposed to forces that do not require invitation to work their changes. The Night Lords who have fallen most completely to chaos are the Night Lords who have lost the specific self-awareness that the Legion's culture maintained, who have lost the knowing what they are and what they are doing and what it means, who have descended into the kind of purely operational violence that Uzaz represented, violence that is no longer in service of communication, because the communicator is no longer fully present. These Night Lords are not the most feared. The most feared Night Lords are those who are most fully present, most fully aware, most fully capable of the deliberate and calibrated deployment of terror that the doctrine requires, because fully present Night Lords are, Night Lords who can see you and understand you and select from their arsenal of psychological tools the specific tool that will work best on the specific person they are addressing. They are not more violent than the fallen ones. They are more effective. And in the Night Lords' doctrine, effectiveness is the only thing that matters, which is the only way in which the Night Lords maintain a value system at all. The psychic legacy. Talos's visions were not isolated. The Night Lords produce, in their post-heresy recruits, and in the older warriors who carry Curze's gene seed in its most concentrated forms, individuals with some degree of psychic sensitivity that expresses in the Night Haunter's specific mode, the precognitive visions that show futures with terrible. These individuals are not psychers in the conventional sense, not trained by librarians or controlled through the institutional structures that manage psychic ability in loyal Space Marine chapters. They are not managed at all, except by themselves, and the management they apply to visions that show them futures they cannot change is the management that Curze modeled: incorporation, acceptance, and continuation despite the knowledge of what the continuation leads to. This is, in the specific vocabulary of tragedy, the thing that makes the Night Lords irredeemably sad, not pitiable, not sympathetic, but sad, in the way that a thing is sad when it demonstrates clearly and without ambiguity the full cost of what the darkness produces. The Night Lords see where they are going. The ones with the gift of vision see it clearly, with the specific accuracy that Curze's visions always achieved. They know their warbonds will not survive in their current form. They know the raids will become more desperate and the targets more marginal, and the warriors fewer, and the darkness more complete as the millennia pass, and the Legion's remnants continue their slow erosion. They know this and they continue because the continuation is the only thing left, and because stopping would require a reason to stop, and the Night Lords have never had a reason to stop. Konrad Curze saw everything. He saw Nostramo and its darkness. He saw the heresy and its outcome. He saw his own death on Sagualsa in a dark palace, waiting for an assassin sent by his own father. He saw all of it, with the specific and terrible clarity that his gene seed's psychic gift produced, and he built from it the philosophy that became the Night Lord's legacy. The argument that the dark is the baseline and the light is the exception, and the exception cannot be maintained indefinitely against the... He was not wrong. He was not right in any simple sense, because the argument he made was not a simple one and it does not have a simple answer. But he was not wrong. The dark is real. The gap between what the Imperium promises and what it delivers is real. The worlds that call for help and receive it too late are the specific suffering of populations that exist in the outer dark of the galaxy, too far from the Astronomican's light to be a priority and too connected to the Imperium's economy to be left entirely alone, is real, and the Night Lords who prey on those populations are the specific expression of what the dark does, with the space that the light does not reach. What would the galaxy look like if Curze's argument could be answered, if the light were actually sufficient, actually present in all the places it promises to be, if the Imperium were actually the thing it claims to be, rather than the thing it is, which is a dying civilization held together by faith in its own necessity and the specific courage of billions of people who refuse to acknowledge how thin the threads are that connect the parts. The Night Lords would be anomalies in that galaxy, exceptions rather than expressions. The specific horror they represent would be contained, held back by the adequacy of something the Night Lord's existence has always argued was not adequate. But the galaxy is not that. The galaxy is the 41st millennium, the age of the Great Rift and the Noctis Aeterna, and the half of the Imperium that has been cut off from Terra and is fighting in the dark without even the diminished guidance of the Astronomicon, fighting with whatever faith and whatever courage it can maintain in circumstances that put both under more pressure than either was designed to sustain. And in that galaxy, the Night Lord's argument is not an abstract philosophical position. It is a daily operating reality for billions of people on hundreds of worlds. The Night Lords are out there, in the dark, not in the eye of terror, not in some sealed dimension of warp-soaked horror, but in the real space dark, in the space between stars where light takes years to travel and help takes longer. They are in the outer systems where the Astronomicon is too faint to be useful for navigation, and the only ships that come are the ones that come for what they can take. They are in the transit corridors where convoys move between systems, and the emptiness between the convoys' escorts and the system's patrol capacity is real and measurable, and the Night Lords have. They are in the atmospheres of worlds where the darkness of night is not metaphorical, where the night comes every 12 or 20 hours, and in those hours something that was not visible in the day becomes possible. They are waiting, not in the patient, strategic way that an army waits for the right moment to attack, in the way that a predator waits, which is not quite patience and not quite impatience, but something that functions as readiness, as the sustained state of being ready that a thing is in, when the thing it is waiting for is the only thing it knows how to do. The Night Lords are always ready. They have been ready for 10,000 years. The doctrine has been practiced so long that it has passed from instruction into instinct, from the explicit formulation of a military philosophy into the specific quality of awareness that a Night Lord's warrior brings to every environment he enters. The automatic reading of shadows and sightlines and the acoustic properties of enclosed spaces, and the places where the darkness is thick enough to move through unseen. They are the dark's own children, born in it, made for it, returned to it when everything else was taken from them. And the dark is growing. The Cicatrix Maledictum has extended the Night Lord's operational territory in ways they did not plan and could not have predicted, because the Great Rift's effect on the Imperium Nihilus, the half of the Imperium cut off from Terra's light, has recreated on a galactic scale the conditions that Nostramo maintained on a planetary one. Darkness, isolation, the absence of reliable connection to the central authority that provides protection and justice, and the institutional structures that make civilization function. A population that is calling for help, and not certain the call is being received. The Night Lords have been preparing for this their entire existence, though not by intention. Their doctrine is precisely calibrated to the conditions the Imperium Nihilus presents. Their specific capability, the capacity to operate in the dark without the logistical infrastructure that conventional military forces require, is precisely the capability that the Noctis Aeterna has made relevant in ways it was not, quite before the rift opened. They are not more numerous. They are more appropriately deployed by the specific accident of 10,000 years of operating in the margins of an empire that is now half margin. The Night Lords of the current era do not know each other the way the Night Lords of the Heresy knew each other. The fragmentation has proceeded too far for that. Individual warbands may go decades or centuries without encountering another warband that claims the Night Lord's heritage. The occasional convergences, when operational requirement or chance brings multiple warbands into the same system at the same time, are not warm gatherings. They are tense assessments, each warband evaluating the others in the way that predators in close proximity evaluate each other, looking for weakness and advantage, and the specific opportunity that the current configuration of forces presents. Sometimes they cooperate. More often they negotiate the division of available resources and then separate, each continuing on the trajectory that the 8th Legion's centuries of solo raiding have made the default. But when they do speak to each other, in those moments when the Night Lords of the current era are close enough to communicate, without the mediation of warp communication, they speak the old tongue, Nostramo, the language of the sunless world that made them, that none of them have seen in 10,000 years, and that has not existed in any form for nearly that long. They speak it because it is the remaining physical connection to what the Legion was, the last artifact of the culture that produced the doctrine and the identity that the fragmentation has otherwise largely dissolved. They speak it in the way that the last speakers of a dead language speak it, not because the language serves a practical communication purpose that other languages could not serve, but because the speaking itself is the maintenance of a connection, and the connection is to the Night Haunter who gave them the tongue, and to the darkness of Nostramo that gave the Night Haunter everything. Curze is dead. Nostramo is dust. The Legion is scattered across the void in fragments too small to be called a Legion, and too persistent to be called ended. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, a Night Lord's warband is approaching a world that does not know it is being approached, that has been watched for long enough that the watching has become knowledge, that will discover in the specific way that Night Lord's targets always discover it, which is usually at night, usually in a manner calculated to be most effective rather than most efficient. That the dark it has been hoping was empty contains something that has been watching it. Death is nothing compared to vindication. The Night Haunter said this as the last meaningful thing he said in his life, and the Night Lords who have carried it forward into 10,000 years of void predation have made it the closest thing to a catechism the Legion possesses, though they would not use that word because it implies a faith they do not have. They have only the saying, and the specific truth it contains, and the continuation of the argument it is part of. In every raid and every example made and every world that wakes, to discover that the night contained something that the day had been failing to protect it from. The Night Lords do not need to win. They do not need to conquer or overthrow the Imperium or achieve the strategic objectives that armies fight toward. They need only to continue being what they are, in the places where what they are is effective, demonstrating through the continuation of their existence the specific truth that Nostramo taught and Konrad Curze systematized and 10,000 years of practice has maintained against everything the galaxy has attempted to use to end it. The truth that the dark is real, that the light is insufficient, that in the gap between what the light promises and what it delivers, something will always be present that knows the dark better, that has always known it, that was made for it, in the very literal sense that the Night Lords were made on a world without adequate light, selected for, shaped by, and dispatched from that world into the greater dark that the galaxy mostly is. They are out there. They will continue to be out there. And in the darkness that is growing, that the great rift has made more absolute and more present and more inescapable for the billions of people in the Imperium Nihilus who are facing it without the resources they were promised. The Night Lords are the most honest ambassadors of what that darkness contains. Not the most terrible, not the most powerful, the most honest. They have always been the most honest thing in the dark. That is their horror. That is the horror they have maintained since Nostramo, since the sunless world where the Night Haunter first looked into the dark and saw what it was, and built a career on that seeing. They are the truth that the Imperium cannot answer, given form and gene seed and 10,000 years of practice, operating in the spaces that the Imperium's light cannot reach, doing what darkness does to things that grow up in it. They will be there when the light finally goes out, waiting, ready, saying in the only language they know, which is the language that fear speaks when everything else has been stripped away. That the dark was always real, and they were always in it, and they were always right about what it contained. The Lord of the Night is dead. The Night Lords are not. Av Dominus Nox. The psychology of Konrad Curze requires more attention than most accounts give it, because most accounts treat his dual nature as an interesting detail rather than the central organizing fact of everything the Night Lords are. The two selves that shared his body and his history were not simply a metaphor for internal conflict. They were a specific and documentable division of personality, something that the apothecaries who had limited access to Curze's physiology during the Great Crusade period described in terms that the medical tradition of the time had to strain to accommodate, because the medical tradition of the time was not accustomed to the specific kind of damage that precognition combined with Nostramo's particular formative environment produced in a being of Primarch-level intelligence and Primarch-level capacity for experience. Konrad Curze was the man who could participate in the governance of the crusade, who could sit in the councils and engage in the policy discussions and argue his positions with the sophistication of an intelligence that had been reading the structural dynamics of civilizations since childhood. He was the being who, in his better moments and in his more politically sophisticated deployments, could be mistaken for the kind of Primarch that the Great Crusade needed, cold and difficult and philosophically pointed but within the range of the acceptable. He was the one who argued, who debated, who chose his moments for confrontation with some degree of strategic awareness of the impact his confrontations would produce. The Night Haunter was older than Konrad Curze. He was the first self, the one that Nostramo made before the Emperor arrived and provided context and vocabulary, and a larger framework in which the thing Nostramo had made could function. The Night Haunter was the predator in the dark, the being of pure function, who did what the darkness demanded, because the darkness demanded it, and because the darkness was the only reality he had known long enough to trust. He was the one who arranged the bodies. He was the one who selected the method of display. He was the one who calculated the impact of specific acts on specific populations with the specific quality of intelligence that pure predatory function can achieve when it is applied by a Primarch-level mind to problems of terror and compliance, and the management of fear as a political instrument. They were in the same body. The switching between them was not predictable, and not controlled by either, or rather was controlled by whatever the Primarch psychology had developed as its switching mechanism. which Curze himself was not always able to describe clearly, and which witnesses described differently depending on which self they had been dealing with in the moment before the switch. People who had been in conversation with Konrad Curze, the man sometimes found that the man was no longer there, that something else had replaced him without any visible transition. Something that engaged with the current situation differently and moved differently and looked at them differently in a way that made the looking feel like being looked at by a thing that had not decided whether you were worth keeping. The visions contributed to the splitting. A mind that receives information from two timelines, the present that is happening and the future that the visions make as vivid as present experience, is a mind that is already operating under an unusual cognitive load. A mind that receives that information from childhood, before the psychological structures are in place that allow for the management of such information, is a mind that builds its foundations around the gap between what is happening now and what the visions show is going to happen. And the gap is where the Night Haunter lived, in the space between the now and the terrible future that the now was building toward. This is where the specific quality of the Night Lord's horror originates, not in the sadism of individuals, which was real but was not the point, and not in the military doctrine of terror, which was effective but was a downstream product. The horror originates in the specific experience of being Konrad Curze, which was the experience of knowing what was coming and being unable to stop it, of having the most accurate possible information about the future and being unable to use that information to produce a future different from the one the visions showed. The Night Haunter was not a nihilist in the abstract, philosophical sense of a being who had concluded through reasoning that existence was without meaning. He was a nihilist in the specific experiential sense of a being who had been shown, with consistent and terrible accuracy, that the actions available to him did not produce the outcomes he would have chosen if outcomes were something he could determine. This is what the visions produced in Curze that they did not produce in other psychers with precognitive ability, and it is the feature of his specific gift that makes it the most terrible version of what foreknowledge can be. Most precognition operates in the space of possibility, showing what might happen if certain conditions are met, providing information that can be used to change the conditions and thereby change the future. Curze's precognition did not work this way. It showed not possibilities but certainties, not might but will, not options but the option that reality was going to choose, regardless of any intervention that Curze or anyone else attempted. He could not change what the visions showed. He could only watch them, and then watch reality perform them exactly as shown, with the specific fidelity that made the watching indistinguishable from memory rather than prophecy. Imagine what this does to a mind over decades and centuries. Imagine having the most accurate information available to any being in the galaxy about what is going to happen to you and to the people around you and to the galaxy's large historical arc. And having that information be consistently, exhaustively specific about the worst of it. Not uniformly catastrophic, because the visions were not uniformly catastrophic. They showed everything, the small domestic moments as well as the great historical ones. But the catastrophic ones were the ones that could not be deflected, and the small domestic ones were the ones that could not be preserved. And the combination produced in Curze the specific texture of despair that expressed itself as the Night Haunter's argument, that the worst was inevitable and the best was temporary, and the only honest position was to acknowledge both without the kind of self-deception that maintaining hope in defiance of the evidence required. The Night Lords inherited this psychology, not through direct transmission of Curze's experience, which was not transmissible, but through the gene seed that carried something of his psychological orientation, and the legion culture that was built to function in the space that orientation created. Night Lords are, as a category, beings who do not entertain significant hope about outcomes. They assess situations. They identify what is possible. They do what is possible with whatever resources are available. And they do not expend resources on the maintenance of hope when hope is not supported by the assessment. Because the Legion's foundational psychology was built by a being for whom hope and the evidence had been in constant conflict since childhood. The specific terror techniques of the Night Lords, the ones that appear consistently across documented accounts of their operations from the Crusade era to the current period, are the practical expression of this psychology as applied to the problem of controlling other beings. They are techniques that eliminate hope, not through the simple mechanism of overpowering resistance, which any sufficiently large force can accomplish, but through the more specific mechanism of demonstrating to the target population that hope in this situation is not supported by the evidence. The leaving of advanced warning is perhaps the most effective of these techniques, and certainly the most distinctively Night Lords in its specific application. The Night Lords do not begin raids. They begin preparations for raids that they allow the target population to partially perceive, creating a state of anticipated horror that the population inhabits for hours or days before the actual arrival of the force. The population knows something is coming. It does not know exactly when or exactly from what direction. It cannot effectively prepare, because preparation requires the specific information that the Night Lords have withheld. It can only wait and imagine, and the imagination of beings in danger is reliably more creative than any specific outcome the Night Lords could actually produce. They use the target's own psychology as a weapon, directing the fear response toward outcomes that may or may not reflect the actual plan, occupying the defender's attention and energy with anticipations that may be entirely wrong, and then arriving from whatever angle the intelligence assessment has determined is least effectively defended. The sounds. The Night Lords' use of sound as a weapon is one of the more specific and more studied aspects of their doctrine, because sound operates differently from visual terror in ways that make it useful in situations where visual terror is not available, which in the darkness where Night Lords prefer to operate is most situations. They understand that certain frequencies and certain specific combinations of frequencies produce involuntary responses in human physiology, responses that the evolutionary history of the human nervous system has hardwired as danger signals, because they were danger signals in the environments where human evolution occurred. They understand that human hearing does not stop functioning when human vision is impaired by darkness, which means sound can reach people that darkness is protecting from visual stimuli. And they understand that a sound that cannot be explained, that does not fit the category of any known threat, produces a specific quality of fear that explicable threats do not produce, because the imagination's contribution to the fear is unconstrained when the imagination has no information to constrain it. Night Lords' warbands carry acoustic systems designed around these understandings. The sounds they deploy before and during raids are not random. They are selected or composed for their specific effects on human nervous system response, tested against different population types, refined through the kind of empirical iteration that 10,000 years of practical application produces. The Night Lords who design these systems are not artists in the aesthetic sense. They are engineers in the most functional possible sense, applying the specific scientific understanding of fear as a weapon with the rigor that the Night Lord's doctrine demands. The Night Vision. The Night Lords see in the dark better than any other category of space marine, and this capability is not simply a tactical advantage. It is a philosophical statement, a feature of the gene seed that communicates without words what the Night Lords are and what environment they belong to. When a Night Lord's warrior moves through absolute darkness that a normal human cannot navigate at all, he is not simply using a capability. He is inhabiting his natural environment, moving through the medium that the gene seed identifies as home, operating with the specific comfort of a being that was made for the conditions it is currently in. The darkness is not a disadvantage the Night Lords overcome. It is the operational medium they have always been built for. The crucifixions. The public display of bodies in positions of symbolic significance is the Night Lord's most iconic specific technique, and also the one most easily misunderstood as simple sadism when it is in fact something considerably more calculated. The choice of position, the choice of victim, the choice of location, the choice of what the display communicates about the specific violation that produced it. These are all deliberate choices made with the specific intent of communicating a specific message to a specific audience. A Night Lord's crucifixion is not simply a body on a wall. It is a statement, and the statement's content depends entirely on who is being displayed, in what position, in what location, with what specific contextual markers that allow the audience to read the statement accurately. Garrisoned soldiers crucified on their own fortifications, the statement is that the fortifications did not protect them, which means the fortifications will not protect you. Citizens displayed in poses that mimic their occupational roles, the statement is that your ordinary life is visible to us, that we saw you in your ordinary life before you saw us, that the normalcy you were inhabiting was already inside our awareness. Aristocrats and leaders displayed in positions of humiliation. The statement is that authority does not protect its possessors, which is the specific communication that matters most to populations that have organized their compliance around the belief that authority provides protection. The Night Lords read audiences. They select their statements with an awareness of what the audience needs to receive in order for the fear to be most effective at producing the specific compliance that the operation is aimed at. They do not have a single message. They have a vocabulary, and they compose from that vocabulary the specific message that the specific situation requires. This is the intellectual level at which the Night Lords operate, below the surface of the violence that is their visible face, and it is the level that makes them genuinely different from simply very effective killers. The debates of the Thramas years deserve more attention than they typically receive in accounts of the heresy, because the debates between Curze and the Lion during that prolonged campaign contain some of the most direct articulations of the Night Lord's philosophical position that the record preserves. The Lion engaged with Curze on the philosophical level, which other Primarchs had generally tried to avoid because engaging on that level gave Curze the specific advantage of a being who had been making his argument for decades against various interlocutors, and had refined it to the point where the standard responses no longer reached it. The Lion's engagement was different. because the lion was not attempting to win the argument in the way that Sanguinius had attempted to win the argument, by finding the specific flaw in Curze's position that would cause the position to collapse. The lion was attempting to understand the argument, to map its full structure before engaging with any specific part of it, which was the intellectual method that the First Legion's Primarch applied to all complex problems, and which produced, in this case, a more rigorous engagement with the Night Haunter's position than the Night Haunter had previously encountered. The lion agreed that fear was effective. This was not a concession that Curze had needed, because Curze had never argued that fear was effective on the grounds that its effectiveness was disputed. He had argued that it was the only thing that was effective, and the lion did not agree with this. The lion argued that fear without order, terror without the institutional structures that directed fear toward functional compliance rather than simply panic, was self-limiting, that populations kept compliant through terror without the supplementary experience of justice and protection, and the positive dimensions of governance were populations that would dissolve into chaos the moment the terror was removed. The Night Lords had demonstrated this on Nostramo. They had demonstrated it again wherever their post-censure operations had occurred. The compliance lasted exactly as long as the Night Lords were present to maintain it. Curze's response was that this was not an argument against his method, but an argument that his method was the only honest version of what every method of governance was doing, which was purchasing compliance through the credible threat of force and maintaining it through the periodic demonstration that the threat was real. The institutional structures the lion praised as supplementing fear with justice were, in Curze's analysis, the mechanisms by which the fear was made palatable and sustainable and invisible to those experiencing it, which was a sophisticated improvement on the crude version he practiced, but was not a fundamentally different thing. He asked the lion whether the Dark Angel's own compliance operations had ever proceeded without the underlying threat of force, whether any world had ever accepted the Emperor's authority without understanding that refusal would result in the application of overwhelming military capability, whether the phrase brought into compliance meant anything other than made sufficiently afraid of the alternative to stop resisting. The lion said that the difference between a civilization built on fear and a civilization built on law was real even if both required force to maintain. Because a civilization built on law was building towards something while a civilization built on fear was only maintaining a moment. The direction mattered. The aspiration mattered. Even if the aspiration was not yet achieved, even if the gap between what was aspired to and what currently existed was large, the aspiration oriented the civilization toward improvement in ways that a civilization built purely on the maintenance of terror did not. Curze asked whether the aspiration was real, or whether it was a story that beings who could not tolerate the truth told themselves to make the truth manageable. He asked whether the lion believed that the Imperium was actually building toward the aspiration, or whether the aspiration was static, a fixed point against which the current state was measured and found wanting and would always be found wanting. A destination that provided moral orientation without ever being reached, which was a more sophisticated version of maintaining compliance through fear, because it maintained compliance through hope that was never quite fulfilled. Neither of them convinced the other. This is perhaps the most important fact about the debates, that neither the lion's institutional argument nor the Night Haunter's nihilistic counter produced a resolution. because the question they were actually debating was not a question that admits of a resolution through argument. The question was whether the universe contains the possibility of genuine moral improvement, or whether it is, at its baseline, the kind of place that produces Nostramos when left to its own processes. And the answer to that question is not available through philosophical debate. It is available only through evidence, and the evidence is the ongoing history of the galaxy, which both the Lion and the Night Haunter could observe, and which neither of them would have described as conclusively resolving in the direction the other preferred. The debates ended when the military situation required their ending, which is to say when the Lion had achieved sufficient operational advantage that the debate was no longer between equals, and Curze decided that the cost of continuing was not proportionate to the outcome. He escaped from the campaign, as he escaped from most things that he had decided were not worth the cost of continuing, with the specific ability to remove himself from situations that did not serve his immediate purposes, that had always been one of his most frustrating characteristics from the perspective of those trying to contain him. And the Lion went on to the heresy's conclusion. And Curze went to Sagualsa, and the debate continued in the Night Lords' existence after both of them were gone, because the debate was never between two individuals. It was between two ways of understanding what the galaxy was and what it was possible to build in it, and both ways of understanding are still present in the 41st millennium, in the Night Lords who inhabit the dark and the Imperium that tries to maintain the light, and neither has conclusively won. What the Night Lords represent, in the largest possible frame, is the specific position that the debate takes when one of its participants has given up on the debate. They do not argue anymore. Curze argued until Sagualsa, until the argument was answered by his own death in the specific way he had predicted it would be answered. The Night Lords that followed him do not argue because there is no one to argue with, because the argument has been made and the response has been given, and the response was a Collidus assassin in the dark. And you cannot refine a philosophical position in response to an assassin. You can only note that the response confirms the position and continue. They continue 10,000 years, and they continue. Across the fracture of the Legion into warbands, and the loss of Nostramo, and the loss of their Primarch, and the loss of everything that would have given a Legion its reason to continue. They continue. Not because they have found a reason to continue that is superior to the reasons they have to stop, but because they have not found a way to stop that does not require doing nothing. And doing nothing is not in the Night Lord's operational vocabulary. They will continue until the last Night Lord's warband is destroyed in some dark corner of the void where nobody was watching closely enough to document it, or until the galaxy ends in whatever form the competing eschatologies of Chaos and Xenos and the Imperium's slow entropy finally produce, or until something in the universe changes enough that the Night Lord's argument is finally answered in a way that is more complete than an assassin in the dark. They do not expect that last possibility. The visions in those Night Lords who still have them do not show it. But then, the visions have always shown the worst and the certain and the coming, never the best and the possible and the might yet be prevented. If there is a future in which the Night Lord's argument is answered, a future in which the light is genuinely sufficient to the dark, and the gap between what the Imperium promises and what it delivers is genuinely closed, the visions would not show it. The visions have never been optimistic. Neither for 10,000 years have the Night Lords. Ave Dominus Nox. Hail the Lord of the Night. It is a prayer to a dead man, offered by warriors who do not believe in prayer, maintaining the form because the form is all that remains of the content. And because the form itself is the argument, the continuing demonstration that the night endures when the Lord does not, that the darkness outlasts its darkest sun. That Nostramo's lesson was never about a single being or a single world, but about the nature of the dark itself, and what the dark produces when given sufficient time and sufficient human material to work with. The Night Lords are that production. They are Nostramo's truest export, sent into the void to demonstrate a truth that no world and no civilization and no amount of light has yet managed to conclusively disprove. The dark is real. It is here. It has always been here. And it is watching you. The gene seed that Konrad Curze left to his legion carries something that neither his biology nor his theology can fully account for. A residue of what Nostramo made him in the years before the Emperor's arrival, when he was the Night Haunter and nothing else, and the only context available was the sunless world and the darkness, and the visions that showed futures he could not prevent. The Night Lords who carry his gene seed carry that residue. It manifests differently in different warriors, in some as the precognitive visions that are the gene seed's most dramatic psychic expression, in others as a subtler orientation toward the dark, a preference for the absence of light that goes beyond tactical advantage into something that looks, from the outside, like comfort. The Night Lords are comfortable in the dark, not merely capable of operating in it. Comfortable there, in the way that a being is comfortable in the environment it was made for. The gene seed also carries the specific physical traits that Nostramo produced in Curze. The pale skin, drained of the warmth that exposure to adequate sunlight produces in human biology, is a Curze trait transmitted through the gene seed with remarkable consistency. Night Lords are pale, not uniformly, because the populations they recruit from in the post-heresy era are diverse, and the gene seed's expression of this particular trait is not absolute, but consistently enough that it is one of the visual markers that identifies Night Lords warriors to those who know what to look for. They look like they have never been in sufficient light, which is accurate, because the gene seed they carry was produced by a being who spent his formative years in the near dark of a dying sun, and who never entirely left that darkness even when everything around him changed. The black veins. Curze's own physical appearance, those dark veins visible beneath skin that was already pale enough to make their visibility striking, expressed something about what the Primarch was that his biology had found a way to make externally legible. In some Night Lords warriors, the gene seed produces a similar effect, not identical, not as pronounced as in the Primarch himself, but recognizable to those who have seen it before. It is one of the more unsettling of the physical inheritance markers, because it makes the darkness of the Night Lords not a metaphorical quality, but a literally visible one. An internal darkness expressed on the surface of the body in the way that the Night Haunter's internal landscape was always visible to those who looked at him. The Night Lords do not have a faith, in the sense that the other traitor legions have faiths. The word-bearers have the most elaborate faith in the galaxy, a fully developed theology of the Chaos Gods that has been refined across 10,000 years of theological debate and practical application. The Death Guard have Nurgle, the specific theology of acceptance and decay that Mortarion has embraced, and that his warriors express in their relationship to disease and rot, and the strange peace that Nurgle's gifts provide. Even the World Eaters, who are less theologically sophisticated than most, have the specific faith of Khorne, the belief that the blood god's hunger is real and that killing in his name is meaningful in the specific way that performing a religious act is meaningful. The Night Lords do not have this. They have the Legion heritage and the gene seed and the doctrine, none of which are faith in any meaningful sense. They have the memory of Curze, which functions in some warbands as a kind of cult of personality. The Night Haunter as a figure whose choices and arguments and ultimate death are preserved and referenced in ways that give the warband's existence a kind of retrospective justification. But this is not faith. Faith requires belief in something beyond the material. Belief in the possibility that the actions of the faithful connect to something larger and more meaningful than the immediate consequences of those actions can themselves produce. The Night Lords do not believe in this possibility. They are, functionally, the only traitor legion whose nihilism is genuine, whose refusal of the supernatural is maintained as a philosophical position, rather than simply being the absence of a sufficiently compelling supernatural offer. This makes them lonely, in a way that none of them would use that word to describe, but that is legible in the texture of their existence. The other traitor legions have community in a sense that transcends their physical proximity. The community of shared belief, of understanding oneself as part of a cosmic project larger than the Night Lords have only each other, in the specific physical sense of being in proximity to warriors who share their gene seed and their heritage and their doctrine. When that proximity ends, when the warband separates or the warriors in it die, what is lost is not replaceable by appeal to any shared faith. The Night Lords are alone in the void in a way that the other traitor legion, for all their damnation, are not. Some Night Lords find something like purpose in the hate. Hatred of the Imperium. Hatred of the system that produced Nostramo and then produced Konrad Curze and then censured Konrad Curze and then sent an assassin to kill Konrad Curze. Hatred of the thing that the Night Lords exist in permanent opposition to. Hatred is not faith, but it is an orientation, a fixed point, that gives direction to the motion that the Night Lords are always in, and direction is sufficient in the absence of destination. They do not need to know where they are going to continue moving. They need only something to move against. The Imperium provides that, reliably, in the specific way that a target that will not stop existing provides a target for beings who will not stop attacking. The Imperium, in its institutional awareness of the Night Lords, maintains a relationship to them that is different from its relationship to the other traitor legions, in ways that reflect the Night Lords' specific horror. The other major traitor legions are strategic threats whose monitoring is the responsibility of specific imperial institutions. The Grey Knights for demonic incursion, the Inquisition's Ordo Hereticus for ideological corruption, the relevant Chamber Militant for large-scale military engagement. The Night Lords are monitored by the same institutions and engaged by the same forces. But the nature of the monitoring required is different, because the nature of the threat is different. The Night Lords do not require monitoring for strategic indicators of imminent Black Crusade. They require monitoring for the specific, immediate, local indicators of real space predation, which are patrol logs and shipping reports, and the absence of expected communication from isolated settlements. and the specific pattern recognition that identifies Night Lords' operations from the evidence they leave behind. The Inquisitors who specialize in Night Lords' intelligence are a specific category of Inquisitor with a specific psychological profile. They tend to be individuals who have developed, through long exposure to what the Night Lords do and how they do it, an understanding of the Night Lord's doctrine that approaches the Night Lord's own understanding of it. Not sympathy, understanding. The understanding of a researcher who has studied a subject long enough that the subject's logic becomes accessible even when the conclusions of that logic are completely unacceptable. These Inquisitors are effective at their work. They are also, as a category, the Inquisitors most likely to eventually be reviewed by their peers for signs that their understanding has crossed a line that the Inquisition maintains between useful knowledge and dangerous familiarity. The Night Lords would find this amusing, if they were capable of finding anything amusing in the way that implies genuine lightness, rather than the dark humor that is the closest thing to lightness their culture produces. The institution that monitors them is itself afraid of what monitoring them does to the monitors, which is a specific expression of the Night Lord's argument about the nature of fear, and what proximity to it does to those who are exposed to it long enough. The warband traditions. Each Night Lord's warband, over the centuries and millennia of its independent existence, has developed specific traditions that distinguish it from other warbands in ways that supplement the shared Legion heritage with the particular character of the warband's leadership and operational history. These traditions are not codified in any central document, because there is no central authority to codify them. They are maintained through practice and memory, and the specific transmission that occurs when new warriors enter a warband, and are shown how the warband does things and why, in the way that all cultures transmit themselves to new members. The names the warbands give themselves are often Nostraman, or Nostraman derived, because the Nostraman tongue is the connection to the Legion's original identity that warbands maintain regardless of how far their practice has drifted from the Nostraman original. Names drawn from the Night Haunter's own epithets, names drawn from the specific vocabulary that Nostramo developed for the things the darkness contained. Names that function, when spoken in the presence of people who know what they mean, as the complete communication of everything the warband is, and what it is capable of, delivered in the most economical possible form. The symbols, the Night Lord's heraldry, the blue-black of their power armor and the lightning bolts and the bat-winged skulls, and the crows that Sevatar adopted as his specific symbol, and that some warbands have maintained in his memory, are maintained with a specificity that the post-heresy state of the Legion does not obviously support. Warbands that are raiding for spare parts and ammunition and basic maintenance resources maintain the specific aesthetic markers of their heritage with a care that suggests these markers are understood as meaningful in ways that go beyond tactical identification. They are the remaining material expression of a Legion identity that has lost its institutional content, the form without the content, maintained because the form is the last thing left that is shared between all Night Lords, in a universe that has taken everything else. In some warbands, the maintenance of the aesthetic becomes something that looks, from the outside, like a ritual. Warriors who take time in the middle of a raiding campaign to restore the specific details of their armor's markings, who insist on specific procedures for the application of the Night Lord's particular iconographic vocabulary to new armor or repaired armor, or the armor of newly recruited warriors. This is not vanity. This is the specific behavior of a culture that understands it is losing its content and is attempting to preserve the form against the loss. Because the form is the last available carrier of whatever the content was. The Night Lords are dying. Not quickly, not in any way that will produce a definitive ending in any foreseeable time frame, but the fragmentation that the heresy's failure initiated has continued for 10,000 years and shows no sign of reversing. And the direction of a process that has run for 10,000 years without changing direction is not going to change in the near future absent some specific intervention that nothing in the Night Lord's current situation suggests is coming. Warbands are lost. Warriors die in operations and are not replaced, or are replaced by warriors whose connection to the Night Lord's heritage is attenuated, because their connection to Nostramo, which is gone, is entirely mediated through the gene seed rather than through any direct cultural transmission. The gene seed drifts. The doctrine is maintained but in forms that have been simplified over centuries of operation without the institutional resources that maintain doctrinal precision. What the Night Lords will be in 10,000 more years, if any of them persist that long, is impossible to predict with confidence. The process that has been running for the first 10,000 years suggests continuing fragmentation, continuing reduction in operational scale, continuing drift in doctrine towards something that preserves only the most essential features of the Night Lord's method. Because only the most essential features are simple enough to be maintained through oral tradition and practice alone. The specific intellectual sophistication of the doctrine, the calibration of messages and the selection of techniques for specific psychological effects on specific populations, requires resources to maintain that the warbands do not reliably have. What persists without those resources is the outline, the basic practice of terror without the sophisticated theory that made the practice most effective. But even the outline is the Night Lord's argument. Even the most degraded version of the Night Lord's practice, the most simplified expression of what Nostramo produced and Konrad Curze systematized, demonstrates the thing that the Night Lords have always demonstrated. That the dark is real. That there are things in it. That the things in it are made of the same material as the people which is human darkness, given form and purpose, and 10,000 years of practice. Konrad Curze died on Sagwalsa with the conviction that his death would vindicate his argument. He was right that his death would be consistent with his argument. He was right that the Emperor, or whoever made the decision to send Meshen rather than to address the Night Haunter's position through any of the formal mechanisms that the Imperium maintained for addressing the positions of beings it disagreed with, chose a method indistinguishable in kind from the Night Lord's own method. He was right that this was interesting, and that the irony of it was legible to anyone willing to look at it directly. Whether it was vindication depends on what you think the argument was trying to prove. If the argument was trying to prove that the Emperor's methods and the Night Haunter's methods were indistinguishable, then the assassination proves the point. If the argument was trying to prove that the Imperium is not worth building or worth defending, then the assassination does not prove this, because the methods used in extreme circumstances against a specific category of threat are not the methods that characterize the entire enterprise. If the argument was trying to prove that the dark is real and that the light is insufficient to it, then the argument needed no vindication from the assassination. because the galaxy has been proving this continuously since before Nostramo was settled. The Night Lords continue because Curze's argument continues. The argument continues because the conditions that produced it continue. The conditions continue because the galaxy is what it is, which is a place where the dark is real and the light is insufficient, and in the space between what the Imperium promises and what it can actually deliver, something has always been waiting that knows the dark better than anything built by the light. That something is the Night Lords. It was always the Night Lords, and it will be the Night Lords until the last warband is gone, and the last warrior carrying Curze's gene seed is dead, and the last echo of the Nostraman tongue fades in the void between stars, where it was never designed to survive but has survived anyway, as the Night Lords have survived everything, through the specific endurance of things that were made for darkness, and have found that the galaxy keeps producing it. The darkness endures. The Night Lords endure in it. And the galaxy turning slowly on the axis of its own catastrophe, surrounded by the Great Rift and the silent half that has lost its connection to the Astronomicon, and the thousand threats that press in from every direction, continues to produce the conditions that the Night Haunter always said it would produce. He was not wrong about the dark. He was never wrong about the dark. The only question was always whether being right about the dark was sufficient justification for becoming part of it, and that question does not have a clean answer, because clean answers are a feature of the light, and the Night Lords belong to something else. Arv Dominus Nox. The Lord of the Night is dead. His lesson endures in the void, spoken in a dead tongue by the remnants of a legion that was born in darkness and will die there, maintaining until the end the specific argument that the darkness makes against everything that tries to deny it. The dark is watching. It has always been watching. And it will watch until there is nothing left to watch, and then it will be the only thing that remains. That is the full horror of the Night Lords.